Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. Story 1. We journey to the San Francisco Bay Area, to the small city of Oakley, California, where a young woman's life was cut tragically short in what would become one of the most heart-wrenching cases of domestic violence and murder in recent years. This is the story of Alexis Gabe, a vibrant 24-year-old whose disappearance in January 2022 would captivate a community, mobilize hundreds of volunteers, and ultimately reveal the devastating consequences of a relationship that had turned deadly. It's a story that reminds us how quickly love can transform into something dark and dangerous, and how the people we trust most can sometimes become the greatest threat to our safety. Alexis Gabe was the kind of young woman who made an impression wherever she went. At 24 years old, she possessed that particular combination of beauty, intelligence, and warmth that drew people to her naturally. Those who knew her described her as someone who lit up every room she entered, whose laughter was infectious, and whose kindness was genuine. Living in Oakley, California, a small city of about 40,000 people in Contra Costa County, Alexis had built a life that many her age would envy. Oakley sits on the eastern edge of the San Francisco Bay Area, far enough from the urban centers to maintain a small-town feel, but close enough to offer opportunities and excitement when desired. It's a community of working families, of people who choose to live there because it offers both affordability and a sense of safety. Alexis worked as a merchandiser, a job that took her to various retail locations throughout the Bay Area. It was work that suited her personality. She enjoyed meeting people, had an eye for detail, and took pride in doing her job well. Her colleagues knew her as reliable and professional, someone who brought a positive attitude to work every day. But perhaps most importantly, Alexis was deeply loved by her family. Her parents, Gwyn and Roland Gabe, had raised their daughter with strong values and unwavering support. They were the kind of parents who stayed involved in their adult daughter's life, not out of interference, but out of genuine care and interest. Alexis spoke to her mother regularly, shared the details of her daily life, and maintained the kind of close family relationships that many people cherish, but not everyone is fortunate enough to have. Like many young women her age, Alexis was navigating the complexities of modern dating and relationships. She had been in a relationship with a man named Marshall Curtis Jones, age 27, who lived in nearby Antioch. The relationship had been serious enough that they had moved in together at one point, sharing dreams and making plans for their future. But relationships are complex, and not all love stories have happy endings. By late 2021, Alexis and Marshall's relationship had begun to deteriorate. What had once been a source of joy and companionship had become something more complicated, more troubling. Friends and family members, who knew them both, would later describe warning signs, instances of controlling behavior, arguments that seemed disproportionate to their causes, and a gradual change in Alexis's demeanor when she was around Marshall. In December 2021, Alexis made the difficult decision to end the relationship. It's never easy to walk away from someone you've loved, someone with whom you've shared intimate moments and future dreams. But Alexis had reached the conclusion that the relationship was no longer healthy for her, and she had the strength to act on that realization. What Alexis couldn't have known was that her decision to end the relationship would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately cost her everything. Because Marshall Jones was not the kind of man who accepted rejection gracefully, and what happened next would demonstrate just how dangerous it can be when someone refuses to let go. January 26, 2022, began like any other Wednesday for Alexis Gabe. It was a typical winter day in the Bay Area, cool, but not cold, with that particular quality of light that California is famous for, even in the depths of winter. Alexis had plans that day, a work commitment that would take her to Antioch, the neighboring city where Marshall lived. The fact that her work would take her to Antioch was simply a coincidence, part of her regular merchandising route that covered various retail locations throughout the area. But it was a coincidence that would prove to have devastating consequences. Alexis began her day at home in Oakley, getting ready for work with her usual care and attention to detail. She was the kind of person who took pride in her appearance, not out of vanity, but out of self-respect and professionalism. She selected her outfit, did her hair and makeup, and prepared for what she expected would be a routine workday. Before leaving home, Alexis did something that would later prove crucial to the investigation that followed. She took a selfie, a simple photo that captured her in her car, smiling at the camera. It was the kind of casual self-portrait that millions of people take every day, posted to social media without a second thought. But this image would become the last photograph of Alexis alive, a haunting reminder of a life about to be cut short. At approximately 5:30 p.m. that evening, Alexis arrived at the Antioch location where she was scheduled to work. Security cameras at the location captured her arrival, showing her walking into the building with her usual confident stride. She completed her work assignment efficiently and professionally, just as she always did. But when Alexis finished her work and prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. Marshall Jones appeared at her workplace. Whether this was a planned meeting or a chance encounter, or perhaps something more sinister, has never been definitively established. What is known is that Alexis agreed to go with Marshall to his nearby apartment. The decision to accompany Marshall would prove to be the last decision Alexis Gabe would ever make. Security cameras captured them leaving the retail location together at approximately 6 p.m. In the footage, they appear to be walking normally, without any obvious signs of distress or coercion. To anyone watching, they might have looked like a couple heading home together after a routine day. But appearances, as this case would demonstrate, can be devastatingly deceiving. Marshall's apartment was located on Spanos Park Drive in Antioch, a typical residential complex in a working-class neighborhood. It was the kind of place where young professionals and families lived quietly, where neighbors might know each other by sight, but respected each other's privacy. On that January evening, the residents of the complex had no idea that a tragedy was unfolding just doors away from their own homes. What happened inside Marshall's apartment that evening may never be fully known. There were no witnesses to the events that transpired behind those closed doors, no security cameras that could capture the final moments of Alexis's life. But the evidence that investigators would later uncover would paint a horrifying picture of violence and betrayal. What is known is that sometime during the evening hours of January 26, 2022, Alexis Gabe was murdered inside Marshall Jones's apartment. The woman who had started the day with a smile and a selfie, who had completed her work with her usual professionalism, who had trusted someone she had once loved enough to accompany him home, would never leave that apartment alive. But Marshall Jones's crimes were far from over. What happened next would demonstrate a level of callousness and calculation that would shock even experienced investigators, accustomed to dealing with the worst aspects of human nature. In the hours following Alexis's murder, Marshall Jones embarked on what can only be described as an elaborate deception designed to cover up his crime and mislead investigators. It was a performance that would continue for days, requiring him to lie to police, to Alexis's family, and to maintain a facade of innocence, even as evidence of his guilt mounted around him. The first part of Marshall's deception involved Alexis's car. Her white Nissan Infiniti had been parked outside his apartment building when they arrived together. Now it represented evidence that needed to be disposed of, a connection between him and her disappearance that had to be severed. On the morning of January 27, 2022, security cameras captured Marshall driving Alexis's car away from his apartment complex. He drove approximately 20 miles east to the small city of Oakley, where Alexis lived with her family. But he didn't go to her house. Instead, he drove to a parking lot near the Oakley Galleria shopping center, where he abandoned the vehicle. The choice of location was telling. By leaving the car in Oakley, Marshall was attempting to create the impression that Alexis had made it home safely, that whatever had happened to her had occurred in her own city rather than in his apartment. It was a calculated move designed to direct suspicion away from himself and toward other possibilities. After abandoning the car, Marshall needed transportation back to Antioch. Security cameras would later show him walking away from the vehicle and eventually catching public transportation back to his own city. It was a journey that would have taken several hours, time that Marshall spent constructing the lies he would soon tell to anyone who asked about Alexis's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Alexis's family was beginning to worry. She was the kind of daughter who stayed in regular contact with her parents, who called or texted frequently throughout the day. When she failed to come home that night, and didn't respond to calls or messages, Her parents knew something was wrong. Gwen Gabe, Alexis's mother, tried calling her daughter's phone repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. She sent text messages that went unread and unanswered. The silence was completely unlike Alexis, who was conscientious about staying in touch with her family. By the morning of January 27th, when Alexis still hadn't come home and still wasn't answering her phone, the family made the decision to contact the police. They filed a missing person report with the Oakley Police Department, beginning what would become one of the most intensive missing person investigations in the area's recent history. When police began their initial investigation, one of their first steps was to contact Marshall Jones. As Alexis's ex-boyfriend, he was an obvious person to interview about her whereabouts and activities, and Marshall was ready for their questions. In his initial interviews with police, Marshall presented himself as a concerned ex-boyfriend who was worried about Alexis's disappearance. He acknowledged that they had been in a relationship, but claimed that it had ended amicably. He said that yes, he had seen Alexis recently, but insisted that she had left his apartment safely, and that he had no idea what might have happened to her after that. Marshall's performance was convincing enough that investigators initially treated him as a witness rather than a suspect. He appeared cooperative, answering their questions and expressing appropriate concern for Alexis's welfare. He even offered to help with the search efforts, positioning himself as someone who wanted to find her just as much as her family did. But even as Marshall was spinning his web of lies, the evidence that would ultimately expose his deception was beginning to accumulate. The security camera footage that had captured him driving Alexis's car was already in the hands of investigators, though it would take time to analyze and understand its significance. More importantly, Alexis's phone, which had gone silent the night she disappeared, would eventually yield crucial evidence about what had really happened in Marshall's apartment that night. The digital footprints we all leave behind in our modern connected world would prove to be Marshall's undoing. As news of Alexis Gabe's disappearance spread throughout the Bay Area, something remarkable began to happen. What started as a police investigation quickly evolved into a community-wide effort that would involve hundreds of volunteers and demonstrate the power of collective action in the face of tragedy. Alexis's family, led by her parents Gwen and Roland Gabe, refused to sit idly by while their daughter remained missing. They organized search parties, created social media campaigns, and reached out to anyone who might have information about Alexis's whereabouts. Their determination and visible anguish touched the hearts of people throughout the region, many of whom had never met Alexis but felt compelled to help. The search efforts were coordinated through social media, with Facebook groups and other platforms serving as central hubs for organizing volunteers and sharing information. People from all walks of life joined the effort: retired police officers, experienced hikers, local business owners, students, families with children. They came together united by a common purpose to bring Alexis home. The searches covered vast areas of Contra Costa County and beyond. Volunteers walked through parks, combed through vacant lots, explored hiking trails, and checked abandoned buildings. They distributed flyers with Alexis's photograph at shopping centers, restaurants, and community gathering places. The image of her smiling face became familiar to residents throughout the East Bay. Meanwhile, Alexis's family worked tirelessly to keep her story in the public eye. They gave interviews to local news stations, held press conferences, and maintained constant communication with the investigating officers. Gwen Gabe in particular became a powerful advocate for her daughter, speaking with the kind of fierce determination that only a mother's love can inspire. The police investigation, led by the Oakley Police Department with assistance from other agencies, was proceeding on multiple fronts. Investigators were analyzing phone records, interviewing witnesses, reviewing security camera footage, and following up on tips from the public. Each piece of evidence had to be carefully examined and cross-referenced with other information to build a comprehensive picture of what had happened. One of the most significant developments came when investigators located Alexis's abandoned car in the Oakley Galleria parking lot. The vehicle was processed by forensic technicians, who found evidence that would later prove crucial to the case. But perhaps more importantly, security cameras in the area had captured footage of someone abandoning the car and walking away. When investigators analyzed this footage, they made a discovery that would fundamentally change the direction of their investigation. The person walking away from Alexis's car was not a stranger, it was Marshall Jones, the ex-boyfriend who had claimed to know nothing about what happened to her after she left his apartment. This revelation marked a turning point in the case. Marshall had lied to investigators about his involvement in Alexis's disappearance, and that lie suggested he had something much more serious to hide. As February turned into March, and then into April, the search for Alexis continued without success. The initial hope that she might be found alive began to give way to the terrible possibility that she had been the victim of foul play. But her family refused to give up hope, and the community continued to support their efforts. The case began to attract attention beyond the local area. News outlets throughout California and beyond picked up the story. Alexis's photograph appeared on missing person websites and social media pages dedicated to helping find missing individuals. Her story touched people across the country who had never been to Oakley or Antioch, but who were moved by her family's plight. Throughout this period, Marshall Jones maintained his facade of innocence. He participated in some of the search efforts, always careful to appear concerned and cooperative. He continued to speak with investigators when asked, sticking to his story that he had last seen Alexis when she left his apartment safely. But behind the scenes, the evidence against Marshall was mounting. Phone records showed that Alexis's phone had stopped transmitting data while she was at his apartment. Security camera footage placed him in possession of her car hours after he claimed she had left safely. Most damaging of all, forensic analysis of his apartment would eventually reveal evidence of violence that he would find impossible to explain away. By the spring of 2022, it had become clear to investigators that Marshall Jones was not just a witness in Alexis Gabe's disappearance. He was their primary suspect in what they now believed was her murder. The evidence against him had grown from suspicious to overwhelming, and police were preparing to take action. The investigation had revealed a disturbing pattern of deception and evidence tampering that painted a clear picture of guilt. Beyond the security camera footage showing Marshall abandoning Alexis's car, investigators had uncovered digital evidence that contradicted his story at every turn. Cell phone data showed that Alexis's phone had transmitted its last signal from inside Marshall's apartment, at a time when he claimed she had already left safely. Forensic analysis of the apartment revealed traces of blood that DNA testing would later confirm belonged to Alexis. Perhaps most tellingly, investigators discovered that Marshall had made extensive efforts to clean his apartment in the days following Alexis's disappearance, purchasing cleaning supplies and spending hours scrubbing surfaces. The picture that emerged was of a man who had committed murder and then embarked on an elaborate cover-up. Marshall had killed Alexis in his apartment, spent the night disposing of her body in a location that has never been definitively determined, then returned to abandon her car in Oakley to create a false trail. He had then participated in the search efforts and spoken with investigators, all while knowing exactly what had happened to the woman everyone was looking for. In May 2022, investigators made another significant discovery that would provide crucial evidence for their case. Alexis's cell phone case was found discarded along a roadway in rural Amador County, approximately 60 miles east of the Bay Area. The location was significant because it suggested Marshall had traveled far from the urban areas where he and Alexis had lived, possibly to dispose of her body in a remote location where it might never be found. The discovery of the phone case marked a turning point in the family's emotional journey as well. For months, Gwen and Roland Gabe had held on to hope that their daughter might still be alive, that she might have been kidnapped or was being held somewhere against her will. The phone case, discarded in such a remote location, made it much harder to maintain that hope. By early June 2022, investigators had accumulated enough evidence to seek an arrest warrant for Marshall Jones. The warrant was issued on June 1, 2022, charging him with the murder of Alexis Gabe. Police were finally ready to bring him into custody and force him to face the consequences of his actions. But Marshall Jones had no intention of facing those consequences. When he learned that police were looking for him, he made a decision that would bring this case to its shocking and violent conclusion. Rather than surrender to authorities, Marshall chose to run. He fled the Bay Area, traveling north toward the Pacific Northwest in what appeared to be a desperate attempt to escape justice. But in the age of modern communication and coordinated law enforcement, it's virtually impossible for someone to simply disappear, especially when they're the subject of an active manhunt. Marshall's flight from justice would prove to be short-lived, but it would end in a way that no one, not the investigators, not Alexis's family, not Marshall himself, could have anticipated. The case that had begun with one act of violence was about to conclude with another, bringing a form of justice that was both definitive and deeply unsatisfying. The manhunt for Marshall Jones was about to reach its dramatic and final conclusion in the forests of Washington state, far from the California communities where Alexis had lived and died. The manhunt for Marshall Jones led law enforcement agencies across state lines and into the dense forests of Washington state. By June 2, 2022, investigators had tracked Marshall to the area around Tumwater, Washington, a small city near the state capital of Olympia. He was no longer the calm, deceptive figure who had lied to police for months about Alexis's disappearance. He was now a fugitive, desperate, and dangerous. The task of apprehending Marshall fell to a coordinated team of federal marshals and local law enforcement officers. These were experienced professionals who had dealt with dangerous fugitives before, trained in techniques designed to bring suspects into custody safely whenever possible. But Marshall Jones had already demonstrated that he was capable of extreme violence, and the officers approaching him understood that they were dealing with someone who had nothing left to lose. The confrontation took place in a wooded area outside Tumwater, where Marshall had apparently been hiding since fleeing California. When officers located him and attempted to take him into custody, Marshall made a decision that would forever close the book on any hope of learning the full truth about what had happened to Alexis Gabe. Rather than surrender peacefully, Marshall Jones charged at the officers who were trying to arrest him. In law enforcement, this is known as suicide by cop, a situation where someone deliberately creates a scenario that will force police to use deadly force. Whether Marshall's actions were a calculated decision to avoid prosecution or a moment of panic and desperation will never be known. The officers, faced with an imminent threat to their safety, responded as their training dictated. Marshall Jones was shot and killed in the confrontation, dying instantly in the forests of Washington state, far from the California communities where he had lived and where he had committed murder. The news of Marshall's death reached Alexis's family and the investigators who had been working tirelessly to bring him to justice. The reaction was complex and emotionally complicated. On one hand, there was a sense of relief that Marshall would never be able to hurt anyone else, that he would never walk free after what he had done to Alexis. But there was also frustration and sadness that he had escaped the justice system that the family had trusted to hold him accountable. Most significantly, Marshall's death meant that many questions about Alexis's murder would never be answered. He would never face trial, never be forced to confront the evidence against him, never be compelled to reveal where he had hidden Alexis's body. The full truth about her final moments, about what had driven him to kill her, about where he had taken her remains, all of this died with him in the Washington forest. For investigators, Marshall's death represented both closure and frustration. They had identified their suspect and accumulated overwhelming evidence of his guilt, but they would never get the confession or the additional details that might have helped them recover Alexis's body and provide her family with complete answers. The manhunt was over, but the search for Alexis herself was far from finished. Even with Marshall dead, investigators and volunteers continued their efforts to locate her remains and bring her home to her family. They now knew with certainty that she had been murdered, and they had a general idea of where Marshall might have taken her body based on the location where her phone case had been found. The search efforts shifted to the remote areas of Amador County, where the rugged terrain and dense vegetation made the task incredibly challenging. Volunteers continued to donate their time and energy to the effort, driven by their desire to help a family find peace, and to ensure that Alexis received the dignity of a proper burial. The case had taken on a significance that extended far beyond the communities where it had unfolded. It had become a symbol of domestic violence, of the dangers faced by women who try to leave abusive relationships, of the importance of community support in times of crisis. Alexis's story had touched thousands of people who had never met her, but who recognized the universal tragedy of a young life cut short by violence. The search for Alexis Gabe's remains continued throughout the summer and fall of 2022, long after Marshall Jones had been killed, and the immediate criminal investigation had concluded. Her family, supported by volunteers and law enforcement agencies, refused to give up hope of bringing her home. The search focused primarily on Amador County, where Alexis's phone case had been discovered. This rural area, with its rolling hills, dense forests, and remote locations, presented enormous challenges for search teams. The terrain was difficult to navigate, and the vast expanse of possible locations made the task seem almost impossible. But the dedication of those involved in the search was extraordinary. Volunteers traveled from throughout California and beyond, to participate in organized search efforts. They used everything from traditional ground searches to advanced technology, including drones equipped with cameras and ground-penetrating radar, to examine areas that might contain human remains. The searches were emotional and physically demanding. Volunteers would spend entire weekends hiking through difficult terrain, looking for any sign that might lead them to Alexis. Many of these volunteers had never met her or her family, but they had been moved by the story and felt compelled to help in whatever way they could. For Alexis's parents, the ongoing search represented both hope and heartbreak. Every search that failed to find their daughter was devastating, but they couldn't bear the thought of stopping while she remained unfound. Gwyn Gabe became a fixture at search events, thanking volunteers personally and keeping her daughter's memory alive through her tireless advocacy. On November 3, 2022, nearly 10 months after Alexis had disappeared, the breakthrough finally came. Searchers working in a remote area of Plymouth, California in Amador County discovered human remains that would later be confirmed through dental records to belong to Alexis Gabe. The discovery brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to her family. After months of uncertainty, they finally knew where their daughter was. They could finally begin to plan a proper burial and start the process of healing that had been impossible while her fate remained unknown. The location where Alexis's remains were found was consistent with the theory that Marshall had driven her body to a remote area where he hoped it would never be discovered. It was approximately 60 miles from the Bay Area where they had both lived, in terrain that was difficult to access and rarely visited by the general public. The recovery of Alexis's remains marked the end of one phase of her family's journey and the beginning of another. They could finally lay their daughter to rest with the dignity and love she deserved, but they would never fully recover from the trauma of losing her in such a violent and senseless way. The case of Alexis Gabe stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of taking warning signs seriously. It demonstrates how quickly a relationship can turn deadly when one person refuses to accept that it's over, and how the consequences of that refusal can devastate not just the immediate victims, but entire communities. In January 2025, exactly 3 years after Alexis disappeared, her community held a memorial service to honor her memory and to remember the impact she had made on all their lives. Hundreds of people attended, including many of the volunteers who had searched tirelessly for her remains. It was a celebration of her life, rather than just a mourning of her death, focusing on the joy she had brought to others and the positive legacy she had left behind. Her parents have channeled their grief into advocacy, working to raise awareness about domestic violence and to support other families who find themselves in similar situations. They have spoken at conferences, worked with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to domestic violence cases, and created scholarships in Alexis's name to help other young women pursue their dreams. The story of Alexis Gabe is ultimately a story about love, the love of a family that refused to give up, the love of a community that came together in support of strangers, and the love that all of us should have for each other in a world that can sometimes be cruel and dangerous. As the rain continues to fall tonight, we remember Alexis not for how her life ended, but for how she lived, with kindness, with purpose, and with the kind of bright spirit that leaves the world a little dimmer when it's gone. Her story serves as both a warning and an inspiration, reminding us to cherish the people we love, and to never ignore the signs when someone we care about might be in danger. The rain falls, carrying with it the memory of a young woman whose life mattered, whose story touched thousands of hearts, and whose legacy continues in the love of those who remember her. If you're still awake and listening, please don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 2. I want to tell you about Sarah Chen, though I never had the privilege of meeting her while she was alive. I've come to know her through the dozens of people whose lives she touched during her brief time in the coastal town of Mendocino, California. Through their memories, Sarah has become as real to me as any person I've sat across from at a dinner table. This isn't just another missing person case filed away in some detective's cabinet. This is the story of a young woman who came to a small town to study the ocean, and instead stumbled into something that would cost her everything. It's about the way secrets can grow like barnacles on a ship's hull, hidden beneath the surface until they threaten to sink everything above. Sarah disappeared on October 15, 2019, But her story began long before that autumn day when the fog rolled in thicker than usual and never seemed to lift. To understand what happened to her, we need to go back to the beginning, to a spring morning in 2018 when a rental car with Sacramento plates pulled up to a weathered Victorian cottage on Little Lake Road. I've walked that road myself many times since then, trying to see it through Sarah's eyes that first day. The cottage sits behind a white picket fence that's seen better decades, surrounded by towering redwoods that make even sunny days feel like twilight. There's a peace there, the kind of quiet that city folks like Sarah pay good money to find. But as you'll learn, peace can be deceptive in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business, or thinks they do. Sarah Chen was 28 when she first laid eyes on that cottage, though she looked younger with her long black hair usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her face free of makeup except for the sunscreen she applied religiously every morning. She had the kind of quiet beauty that grew on you, not the type to turn heads on a busy street, but the kind that made you want to know what she was thinking about when she got that faraway look in her eyes. She'd grown up in Sacramento, the daughter of Thomas and Linda Chen. Thomas was a high school math teacher who'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s. And Linda was a librarian whose family had been in California for 3 generations. They'd raised Sarah to value education above all else, which is how she ended up with a master's degree in marine biology from UC Berkeley, and a research grant that would change her life in ways none of them could have imagined. The cottage on Little Lake Road had been advertised in the University Housing Bulletin, quiet retreat for serious researcher. Victorian charm, walking distance to coast, $1 $200 month including utilities. Sarah had called the number that same afternoon, speaking with Robert Martinez, the landlord who'd inherited the property from his grandmother. Robert told me later that Sarah's voice on the phone was what convinced him to rent to her sight unseen. She sounded like someone who understood the value of solitude, he said, leaning against his truck in the driveway of the cottage, nearly 2 years after Sarah's disappearance. Robert is the kind of man who measures his words carefully, each one carrying the weight of experience. He's lived in Mendocino his entire 54 years, making his living as a carpenter and handyman, watching the town change as wealthy city folks bought up the Victorian homes as weekend retreats. Sarah wasn't like that, he continued, his weathered hands gesturing toward the cottage. She didn't come here to play at being a local. She came here to work, to understand something about the ocean that the rest of us take for granted. The cottage itself tells a story of a different era, built in 1892 by a lumber baron named Silas Whitmore, no relation to Sarah's research advisor, just one of those coincidences that seem meaningful when you're trying to make sense of a mystery. The house has 11-foot ceilings, original hardwood floors that creak a symphony when you walk across them, and windows that rattle when the Pacific wind picks up in the afternoon. Sarah's first week in Mendocino established the routine she would follow for the next 18 months. She was an early riser, up by 5:30 a.m. every day, rain or shine. Margaret Holloway, who owns the village store on Lansing Street, remembers seeing Sarah's lights on in the cottage when Margaret opened her shop at 6 a.m. That girl was dedicated, I'll give her that, Margaret told me, wiping down the counter that had seen thousands of conversations over the years. Margaret is 73, with silver hair that she wears in the same style she's had for 40 years, and eyes that don't miss much. She's been the unofficial keeper of Mendocino's daily dramas since 1975, when she and her late husband bought the store from the previous owners. Sarah would come in every morning around 7:15, right after I'd finished brewing the first pot of coffee. Large dark roast with oat milk, never varied, not once in all those months. She'd buy a banana, or sometimes one of those protein bars, and we'd chat about the weather. That's how conversations start around here, with the weather, but Sarah was different. She'd ask about the tide charts, about whether the old-timers had noticed changes in the water temperature over the years. Sarah's research focused on the decline of red abalone populations along the Mendocino coast, a problem that had been accelerating over the past decade. Abalone are large sea snails that cling to rocks in the intertidal zone, their shells prized by collectors, and their meat considered a delicacy. But more importantly, they're indicator species. Their health reflects the overall condition of the marine ecosystem. Dr. James Whitmore, Sarah's research advisor at UC Berkeley, had secured the grant that brought her to Mendocino. When I spoke with him in his cluttered office overlooking San Francisco Bay, he described Sarah as one of the most promising graduate students he'd worked with in his 25-year career. She had an intuitive understanding of marine ecosystems that you can't teach, Dr. Whitmore said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he spoke. Most researchers see the data, temperature readings, pH levels, population counts. Sarah saw the story the data was telling. She understood that everything in the ocean is connected, that you can't study one species in isolation. The early months of Sarah's research went smoothly. She established monitoring sites along 12 miles of coastline, from the mouth of the Russian River north to Fort Bragg. 3 days a week, she'd spend hours in tide pools, counting abalone, measuring their shells, taking water samples. The other days were spent at her laptop, analyzing data, and corresponding with researchers around the world who were studying similar population declines. By summer 2018, Sarah had become a familiar figure in Mendocino. The town has fewer than 800 year-round residents, the kind of place where newcomers are noticed and evaluated with the careful attention small communities give to anyone who might be sticking around. Sarah passed whatever unspoken tests the locals had for outsiders. She volunteered at the Mendocino Coast Children's Fund summer reading program, helping kids with science projects and teaching them about marine life. Martha Rodriguez, the librarian who ran the program, remembers Sarah's patience with the children, the way she could explain complex concepts in terms they could understand. She brought in shells and sea stars. Let the kids touch everything, Martha recalled, her voice soft with memory. There was this one boy, maybe 8 years old, who was fascinated by the hermit crabs Sarah showed him. She spent an hour with him, explaining how they find new shells as they grow, how they have to be brave enough to leave their old home to find a better one. Looking back, that seems almost prophetic. It was at the library that Sarah first met David Crenshaw, though their actual relationship wouldn't begin for several more months. David had come in to use the internet. His fishing boat didn't have Wi-Fi, and cell service was spotty out on the water. He was researching market prices for the salmon he'd caught that week when Sarah approached him. "Excuse me," she'd said. "I couldn't help but notice your catch reports on the table. Are you seeing changes in the fish populations? Different species than usual, or changes in where you're finding them?" David later told me that his first impression of Sarah was that she was one of those college types who think they can learn everything from books. But something about her genuine curiosity made him sit down and talk with her for an hour, sharing observations he'd made during his 15 years of fishing these waters. David Crenshaw is what people in Mendocino call local, not just someone who lives there, but someone whose family has worked these waters for generations. His grandfather had fished the same waters, his father too, until a heart attack took him when David was 19. David inherited the boat, a 32-foot Monterey named Linda Marie's, after his grandmother, along with the knowledge passed down through 3 generations of fishermen. He's 34 now, tall and lean in the way of men who do physical work for a living. His hands are permanently stained by salt water and diesel fuel, his face weathered by years of Pacific sun and spray. But his eyes are kind, the pale blue of ocean water on a cloudy day, and when he talks about the sea, his whole demeanor changes. He becomes almost poetic, describing currents and weather patterns, with the intimacy of someone who's spent half his life reading the ocean's moods. Sarah and David's friendship developed slowly over the autumn of 2018. She'd sometimes wait at the harbor when his boat came in, eager to hear about what he'd observed during his days on the water. He'd save unusual specimens for her, fish species that seemed out of place, sea stars with unusual colorations, anything that struck him as different from the norm. She listened, David told me, his voice carrying a weight of loss that nearly 3 years hadn't diminished. We were sitting in the harbor cafe, where he and Sarah used to meet, watching the fog roll in through the harbor mouth. Most people, when you tell them about the ocean, they nod and smile and think you're just some fisherman spinning tales. Sarah heard what I was saying. She understood that the water was changing, that something was wrong. Their relationship turned romantic sometime in early 2019, though both were careful to keep it quiet. David was in the middle of a difficult divorce from his wife of 8 years, a process that had turned bitter when she'd accused him of caring more about his boat than his marriage. She wasn't entirely wrong. David's love affair with the ocean had begun long before he'd met Jennifer, and it would outlast their marriage by decades. Sarah's own reasons for discretion were more complex. She'd grown up in a family where academic achievement was paramount, where her parents had sacrificed so she could pursue her education. The idea of her research being compromised by gossip about her personal life worried her, even in a town as small as Mendocino. She was old-fashioned that way, Margaret from the village store observed. Sarah kept her professional life and her personal life in separate boxes, but you could tell she was happy. That spring of 2019, she had a lightness about her that hadn't been there before. The relationship between Sarah and David deepened through shared fascination with the ocean's mysteries. He'd take her out on the Linda Marie during calm weather, showing her fishing grounds his family had worked for decades. She'd share her research findings with him, explaining how the data she was collecting painted a picture of an ecosystem under stress. We'd anchor in these little coves that you can't reach from land, David remembered, his eyes focused on something beyond the harbor. Sarah would put on her diving gear and disappear underwater for what felt like hours. When she'd surface, she'd be excited about some discovery, a type of algae she hadn't seen before, or the way certain fish were adapting to the changing water temperature. She saw beauty in things most people would consider unremarkable. By summer 2019, their relationship had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah would spend weekdays focused on her research, and weekends exploring the coast with David. They'd drive the winding roads north of town, hiking to remote beaches where David had played as a child. They'd visit the farmers market on Saturday mornings, buying vegetables from local growers and cheese from the Anderson Valley. It was an idyllic period, the kind of happiness that feels fragile even while you're living it. Sarah's research was progressing well, her relationship with David was deepening, and she'd found a sense of belonging in Mendocino that she'd never experienced in Sacramento or Berkeley. But underneath this contentment, something else was developing, a discovery that would change everything. The first sign that something was amiss came in July 2019, during what should have been routine data collection at Sarah's monitoring site near the mouth of Brush Creek. She'd been tracking abalone populations at this location for over a year, and the numbers had been declining steadily but predictably, consistent with the regional trend that was the focus of her research. But on July 15th, something was different. Sarah arrived at the site just after dawn, as was her habit, carrying her waterproof collection bags and her diving equipment. The tide was at its lowest point of the month, exposing rocks that were usually underwater. What she found there would haunt her for the remaining months of her life. In tide pools that had previously teemed with life, Sarah found a graveyard. Dozens of abalone shells, their former inhabitants dead, their bodies already claimed by scavengers. Sea stars were dying too, their arms curled in the distinctive pattern that indicated exposure to toxins. The water itself had an oily sheen that caught the morning light in unnatural rainbows. Sarah's field notebook from that day, later found by investigators, recorded her observations in the precise clinical language of science, but her handwriting betrayed her emotional state. The normally neat script became increasingly erratic as she documented the extent of the die-off. Total mortality event at BS3, she wrote, using her shorthand for the Brush Creek site. Water quality visibly compromised. Strong chemical odor, petroleum-based. Population crash appears recent. Shells still articulated. Soft tissue removal consistent with post-mortem scavenging rather than natural mortality. Dr. Whitmore told me that when Sarah called him that afternoon, she was more upset than he'd ever heard her. She was crying, he remembered, his usually professorial demeanor softening. Sarah was not someone who cried easily. She'd seen plenty of environmental damage during her studies, but this was different. This was acute, severe, and it was happening in what should have been a pristine environment. Sarah spent the next week returning to the site daily, documenting the progression of the die-off, and collecting water samples for analysis. She expanded her survey to other monitoring locations along the coast, finding similar but less severe impacts at 2 other sites. The pattern suggested a source somewhere upstream from Brush Creek, something releasing toxins into the water system that fed the coastal marine environment. The laboratory results from Sarah's water samples arrived 3 weeks later, and they confirmed her worst fears. The water contained elevated levels of heavy metals, chromium, lead, and mercury, along with industrial solvents that had no natural source in the environment. Someone was dumping chemical waste into the watershed, and it was killing the marine life that Sarah had dedicated her career to protecting. This is where Sarah's story intersects with the darker currents of small-town politics and corporate influence. Mendocino County's economy has always depended on its natural resources, first logging, then tourism, with fishing and agriculture filling the gaps. But in recent decades, as environmental regulations tightened and consumer preferences shifted, many of the old industries had struggled to adapt. Redwood Industrial Solutions was one of the companies trying to bridge the gap between old and new California. Founded in 1987 by Marcus Reed, a former lumber executive, the company specialized in processing wood products for export to Asia, where demand for American timber remained strong despite declining domestic markets. Their facility, located 15 miles inland from Mendocino near the town of Ukiah, employed nearly 200 people and was one of the largest private employers in the region. On the surface, Redwood Industrial Solutions appeared to be a responsible corporate citizen. They sponsored Little League teams, donated to local charities, and had received awards from the county for their environmental stewardship programs. Marcus Reed served on the board of the Mendocino Coast Chamber of Commerce and was known for his generous contributions to local political campaigns. But Sarah's investigation revealed a different side of the company. Using public records and Freedom of Information requests, she traced the contamination back to a series of outfall pipes that connected Redwood Industrial Solutions facility to Brush Creek. The pipes were supposed to carry treated wastewater that met strict environmental standards. Instead, they were carrying a toxic cocktail of industrial chemicals directly into the watershed. Sarah's research uncovered a pattern of regulatory violations stretching back nearly 5 years. Redwood Industrial Solutions had been fined repeatedly by state environmental agencies for improper waste disposal, but the fines were small compared to the company's annual profits. It was cheaper to pay the penalties than to properly treat their wastewater, and the company's executives had made a calculated decision to continue polluting. The human cost of this decision extended far beyond the marine life that Sarah studied. Brush Creek supplied drinking water to several small communities downstream from the Redwood Industrial Solutions facility. Children in these communities had elevated levels of heavy metals in their blood. Cancer rates were higher than the state average. But these rural, predominantly Latino communities lacked the political influence to demand action from state regulators. By September 2019, Sarah had assembled a comprehensive case against Redwood Industrial Solutions. She had water quality data, photographic evidence, laboratory reports, and documentation of the company's violation history. She'd also connected with other researchers studying similar contamination issues, building a network of scientific support for her findings. Dr. Whitmore urged caution when Sarah shared her preliminary findings with him. "This is explosive material," he warned her during a phone call in early September. "You're accusing a major employer of essentially poisoning an entire watershed. You need to be absolutely certain of your facts before you go public with this." Sarah spent the next month double-checking her data, repeating experiments, and consulting with experts in environmental toxicology. Every test confirmed her initial findings. Redwood Industrial Solutions was systematically contaminating the Mendocino coast's marine environment, and their illegal activities were directly responsible for the abalone die-off that had first caught Sarah's attention. The question that haunted Sarah was what to do with this information. She could publish her findings in a scientific journal, but the peer review process would take months, during which time the contamination would continue. She could contact environmental groups, but they would need time to build a legal case. She could go to the media, but she worried about being dismissed as just another activist researcher with an agenda. The decision that would ultimately cost Sarah everything came in early October 2019, when she decided to contact the Environmental Protection Agency directly. She prepared a comprehensive report documenting Redwood Industrial Solutions violations and submitted it through the EPA's online whistleblower portal on October 8, 2019. 2 days later, Sarah received the phone call that would change everything. October 10, 2019, started like any other Thursday in Sarah's life. She woke before dawn, made her usual cup of coffee, and settled at her kitchen table to review the previous day's field notes. The cottage was quiet except for the familiar sounds of the old house, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the whistle of wind through the window frames, the distant crash of waves against the bluffs. Emily Rodriguez, Sarah's research assistant, had arrived at the cottage around 7 p.m. that evening. to help organize data for a presentation Sarah was preparing for a marine biology conference. Emily was a junior at UC Berkeley, majoring in environmental science, and she'd been working with Sarah for 6 months. She described Sarah as a mentor who'd opened her eyes to the complexity of marine ecosystems and the importance of environmental protection. Sarah was different that night, Emily told me when I interviewed her at her apartment near the Berkeley campus. Emily is 21 now, but she still carries the weight of being one of the last people to see Sarah before her disappearance. She seemed distracted, checking her phone more than usual, jumping when the house creaked. I asked if she was okay, and she said she was just tired, but I knew something was bothering her. They worked in companionable silence for about an hour, organizing Sarah's research into categories for her presentation. Sarah had decided to focus on the broader implications of abalone decline rather than her specific findings about redwood industrial solutions. "Let's get the science out there first," she told Emily. "The other stuff can come later." At 8:30 p.m., Sarah's phone rang. Emily remembered the call vividly, because Sarah's entire demeanor changed when she answered. The caller ID showed only a number with a 707 area code, local to Mendocino County, but not one Sarah recognized. "Hello?" Sarah had answered cautiously. Emily couldn't hear the caller's voice, but she watched Sarah's face grow pale as she listened. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, with Sarah saying very little beyond, "Yes, I understand, and that's not necessary." When Sarah hung up, she was visibly shaken. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down, and she stared at it for a long moment as if expecting it to ring again. "I need to handle something," Sarah told Emily, her voice carefully controlled. "Can we finish this tomorrow?" Emily gathered her materials, sensing that Sarah needed to be alone. As she was leaving, she turned back to ask if everything was all right, but Sarah had already disappeared into her bedroom. Emily heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, as if Sarah was looking for something. The next morning, Margaret at the village store noticed that Sarah didn't come in for her usual coffee. This was unusual enough that Margaret made a mental note of it, but she didn't think much of it at the time. People change their routines, especially when they're dealing with stress. David was more concerned when Sarah canceled their planned dive on Friday afternoon. She'd sent him a text message that morning, "Feeling under the weather, rain check on today." David offered to bring her soup or medicine, but Sarah declined, saying she just needed to rest. When he stopped by her cottage that evening, Sarah's car was in the driveway, but she didn't answer the door. David could see lights on inside, and he thought he heard the sound of the television, but repeated knocking brought no response. He used his key, the one Sarah had given him 2 months earlier, and found the cottage empty. The scene inside the cottage was puzzling. Sarah's laptop was open on the kitchen table, still logged into her email account. A half-eaten sandwich sat on a plate beside it, as if she'd been interrupted in the middle of lunch. Her coffee mug was still warm to the touch, but Sarah was nowhere to be found, and her car keys were missing from the hook by the front door. David searched the cottage thoroughly, calling Sarah's name and checking every room. In her bedroom he found evidence that she'd been packing. A small suitcase lay open on the bed, partially filled with clothes and toiletries. Sarah's research notebook, the leather-bound journal she carried everywhere, was gone along with her purse and cell phone. Most disturbing was what David found in Sarah's study. File cabinets that had always been locked were standing open, their contents scattered across the floor. Papers were everywhere, research notes, lab reports, correspondence with other scientists. It looked as if someone had been searching for something specific, or perhaps Sarah had been trying to find important documents quickly. David called Sarah's cell phone repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. He drove through town, checking the harbor, the library, the few restaurants that stayed open during the off-season. No one had seen Sarah since Thursday evening. By Saturday morning, David's concern had turned to fear. He contacted Dr. Whitmore, who confirmed that Sarah had missed their scheduled phone conference Friday afternoon, without explanation. This was completely out of character for someone as reliable as Sarah. Dr. Whitmore's attempts to reach Sarah were equally unsuccessful. Her email account showed that she'd logged in Friday morning, but hadn't responded to several messages from colleagues and students. Her university office in Berkeley was locked, and the department secretary confirmed that Sarah wasn't expected on campus until the following week. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah Chen occurred on Sunday, October 13th, at 3:20 p.m. Security footage from the Mendocino Village Shell station showed her purchasing bottled water, trail mix, and a prepaid cell phone, an unusual purchase for someone who already had a smartphone. She appeared to be alone, but the camera angle didn't show the entire parking lot. Tyler Nash, the 19-year-old clerk who served Sarah that day, remembered the interaction because of her nervous behavior. She kept looking out the windows, like she was watching for someone, Tyler told investigators later. When I asked if she was finding everything okay, she just nodded and paid in cash. Most people use cards these days, so cash transactions stick out. The security footage also revealed something that wouldn't be noticed until investigators reviewed it weeks later. In the background of the video, partially obscured by a display rack, a black SUV could be seen in the parking lot. The license plate wasn't visible, and the driver remained in the vehicle, but the SUV appeared to be positioned to observe anyone entering or leaving the store. After leaving the gas station, Sarah seemed to vanish completely. Her car, a blue 2017 Honda Civic, was never seen again. Her cell phone last pinged a tower near Fort Bragg at 4:15 p.m. on Sunday, then went silent. The prepaid phone she'd purchased was never activated. David spent Sunday evening driving every road between Mendocino and Fort Bragg, looking for Sarah's car or any sign that she'd been in the area. He checked hiking trails, beach access points, and scenic overlooks where tourists sometimes pulled off the highway. The fog had rolled in thick that afternoon, reducing visibility to just a few yards, making the search both urgent and futile. As night fell on October 13, 2019, Sarah Chen had been missing for more than 48 hours, though no one realized it yet. The mysterious phone call, the partially packed suitcase, the scattered papers in her study, all suggested that Sarah had left voluntarily, perhaps in response to some threat or emergency. But the complete absence of communication with anyone in her life suggested something far more sinister. Monday morning, October 14th, brought the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes the Mendocino coast magical. The fog had lifted overnight, revealing a landscape painted in the golden light that draws photographers and artists from around the world. But for David Crenshaw, the beauty of the morning only highlighted Sarah's absence. When Sarah failed to appear for her scheduled 9 a.m. meeting with Dr. Whitmore, the professor's concern escalated to alarm. Sarah had never missed a meeting without notice, never failed to return phone calls within 24 hours. Dr. Whitmore spent Monday morning calling hospitals between San Francisco and Eureka, thinking perhaps Sarah had been in an accident and was unable to contact anyone. By Tuesday afternoon, October 15th, David could no longer convince himself that Sarah's absence had an innocent explanation. He drove to the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office in Ukiah, where he filed an official missing person report with Deputy Maria Santos, a 10-year veteran of the department who specialized in missing person cases. Deputy Santos took David's report seriously from the beginning. She'd seen too many cases where early intervention made the difference between finding someone alive and conducting a recovery operation. Sarah's profile, a responsible adult with strong community ties who disappeared without explanation, fit the pattern of cases that rarely resolve themselves. The initial investigation revealed several troubling inconsistencies. Sarah's bank records showed no unusual activity, no large cash withdrawals, no purchases that suggested she was planning to disappear voluntarily. Her credit cards hadn't been used since Friday morning, when she'd bought groceries at the Mendocino market. Most significantly, Sarah's research data had been systematically deleted from her laptop sometime between Friday evening and Sunday afternoon. The deletion wasn't random. Someone with knowledge of her work had specifically targeted files related to her investigation of Redwood Industrial Solutions, while leaving her abalone research intact. Detective Frank Morrison was assigned to lead the investigation on Wednesday, October 16th. Morrison was nearing retirement after 20 years with the Sheriff's Department, but he approached Sarah's case with the methodical thoroughness that had made him one of the county's most successful investigators. Morrison's first step was to reconstruct Sarah's final days through interviews with everyone who'd had contact with her. The picture that emerged was of a woman under increasing stress, though she tried to hide it from most people in her life. Margaret from the village store revealed that Sarah had been asking unusual questions in the weeks before her disappearance. She wanted to know about the history of the area, about which families had been here the longest, who the real power brokers were. Not the kind of questions a marine biologist usually asks. Robert Martinez, Sarah's landlord, provided another piece of the puzzle. He'd noticed increased activity around the cottage in the weeks before Sarah disappeared, cars driving slowly past the house, people walking dogs they'd never owned through the neighborhood, small aircraft flying low over the property. At the time he'd attributed it to tourist season, but in retrospect it seemed like surveillance. The most significant breakthrough came when Detective Morrison obtained Sarah's phone records. The mysterious call she'd received on October 10th had come from a prepaid cell phone purchased with cash at a Walmart in Santa Rosa 3 days earlier. The phone had been used only once, to call Sarah, then discarded. More disturbing was the pattern of calls Sarah had made in the days following that conversation. She'd contacted a lawyer in San Francisco who specialized in whistleblower protection, a private investigator who handled corporate security cases, and 3 different hotels in cities throughout California, apparently researching places where someone could stay anonymously. Dr. Whitmore provided the crucial context when he revealed Sarah's environmental investigation to Detective Morrison. The professor had been reluctant to discuss Sarah's unpublished research, concerned about academic confidentiality, but Sarah's safety took precedence over professional protocols. Sarah had uncovered evidence of systematic environmental crimes, Dr. Whitmore explained during his interview with Morrison. She was planning to take her findings to federal authorities, but she was also afraid. Companies like Redwood Industrial Solutions have resources to protect themselves, and Sarah was just one graduate student with a laptop and a diving suit. The investigation into Redwood Industrial Solutions revealed a company with a troubling history of silencing critics. A former employee named Janet Walsh had tried to blow the whistle on the company's illegal dumping practices in 2017, only to find herself facing a lawsuit for breach of contract and violation of non-disclosure agreements. The legal battle had bankrupted Walsh and effectively ended her career in environmental consulting. Another potential whistleblower, a water quality inspector named Carlos Mendez, had died in a single car accident in 2018, just days before he was scheduled to testify in a state regulatory hearing about Redwood Industrial Solutions violations. The accident investigation found no evidence of foul play, but the timing was suspicious enough to attract attention from federal authorities. As Detective Morrison dug deeper into the company's operations, he discovered a web of connections between Redwood Industrial Solutions and local political figures. The company's CEO, Marcus Reed, had donated heavily to the campaigns of county supervisors, state legislators, and even federal representatives. These contributions had bought influence and protection, allowing the company to continue its illegal activities with minimal interference from regulators. The black SUV that had been spotted near Sarah's cottage and at the gas station became a central focus of the investigation. Motor vehicle records showed that Redwood Industrial Solutions leased a fleet of black Ford Expeditions for their executives and security personnel. When Morrison requested to examine these vehicles, the company's lawyers claimed they'd all been sold to out-of-state buyers just days after Sarah's disappearance. Emily Rodriguez provided another crucial piece of evidence when she remembered something she'd initially forgotten. On the night of October 10th, when Sarah received the threatening phone call, Emily had noticed a man sitting in a car across the street from the cottage. The man appeared to be watching the house, and when Emily looked again a few minutes later, he was gone. He was wearing a baseball cap, so I couldn't see his face clearly, Emily told Detective Morrison, but he had broad shoulders, like someone who worked out regularly. The car was dark-colored, maybe black or dark blue. I remember thinking it was odd because most of the neighbors drive older cars, and this one looked expensive. The investigation also revealed that Sarah had been in contact with someone she identified only as Deep Blue in her encrypted emails. These communications, recovered from Sarah's cloud storage account, painted a picture of someone else within Redwood Industrial Solutions who was willing to provide inside information about the company's illegal activities. The messages from Deep Blue were cryptic but alarming. "They know about your EPA report," one message read. "Security has been asking about researchers in the area. You need to be careful." Another message, sent just 2 days before Sarah's disappearance, was even more ominous. "Something big is happening. They're bringing in outside people to handle problems. Get somewhere safe." Detective Morrison worked with federal authorities to try to identify Deep Blue, but the emails had been sent through multiple proxy servers, making them nearly impossible to trace. Whoever Deep Blue was, they understood operational security and were taking significant precautions to protect their identity. The search for Sarah expanded throughout Mendocino County. Volunteer searchers combed hiking trails and beach access points. The Coast Guard deployed boats and helicopters to search the rugged coastline where Sarah had conducted much of her research. Dive teams explored underwater caves and kelp forests where a body might have been hidden or washed ashore. For 5 days, the community rallied around the search effort. Local businesses provided food and supplies for the volunteers. The Mendocino Volunteer Fire Department coordinated search teams. Even Marcus Reed and several Redwood Industrial Solutions executives participated in the searches, projecting an image of concerned corporate citizens helping to find a missing researcher. But the searches yielded nothing, no trace of Sarah, her car, or any of her personal belongings. It was as if she had simply vanished into the coastal fog that rolled in each evening, leaving behind only questions and the growing fear that something terrible had happened to her. 3 weeks after Sarah's disappearance, just as the daily search efforts were beginning to wind down, a hiker made a discovery that reignited the investigation. Karen Mitchell, a retired teacher from Fort Bragg, was walking her golden retriever along the banks of Brush Creek, the same waterway where Sarah had first discovered the environmental contamination, when her dog began pawing at something partially buried in the creek bed. It was Sarah's research notebook, the leather-bound journal she'd carried everywhere during her time in Mendocino. The notebook was water-damaged but still readable, its pages swollen and discolored, but holding their secrets intact. Most importantly, it contained entries dated up to October 14th, the day after Sarah's last confirmed sighting. Detective Morrison carefully photographed each page before sending the notebook to the state crime lab for analysis. The final entries revealed Sarah's growing paranoia and her desperate attempts to protect her research from what she clearly believed was a coordinated effort to silence her. October 12th. One entry read in Sarah's familiar handwriting. Car followed me to the harbor today. Same black SUV I've seen 3 times this week. When I doubled back to get a license plate number, it disappeared. David thinks I'm being paranoid, but something is wrong. The timing of everything, the phone call, the deleted files, the surveillance, it's too coordinated to be coincidence. The October 14th entry was the most chilling. Deep Blue was right. They're not just trying to discredit me, they want me gone. Found tracking device under my car this morning. GPS unit, professional grade. Moving to safe location until I can figure out next steps. If something happens to me, everything they need is in the red box under the floorboards in the study. The truth needs to come out, even if I can't be the one to tell it. When investigators returned to Sarah's cottage, they found the red box exactly where her note indicated. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in her study were copies of all her evidence against Redwood Industrial Solutions. Water quality reports, photographs of illegal dumping, correspondence with regulatory agencies, and most damaging of all, internal company documents that someone had leaked to her, showing the company's executives knew about and approved the illegal dumping operations. The documents revealed the scope of Redwood Industrial Solutions crimes. For nearly a decade, the company had been systematically dumping untreated industrial waste into Brush Creek and other waterways throughout Northern California. The savings from avoiding proper waste treatment had generated millions of dollars in additional profits, money that had been used to expand operations and purchase political influence. More disturbing were email chains between company executives discussing how to handle the researcher problem. Marcus Reed had written to his head of security, a former military contractor named Vincent Kozlov, instructing him to neutralize the threat using whatever means necessary. The FBI became involved in the case in December 2019, treating Sarah's disappearance as a potential case of corporate retaliation against a whistleblower. Federal agents descended on Redwood Industrial Solutions facilities with search warrants, seizing computers, financial records, and company communications. The federal investigation revealed a company culture of intimidation and violence. Vincent Kozlov had assembled a team of security contractors with backgrounds in military special operations and corporate espionage. These men were well paid to handle sensitive situations that required discretion and deniability. 3 of Kozlov's contractors, Michael Torres, James Patterson, and Robert Kim, had been in the Mendocino area during the week of Sarah's disappearance. Hotel records showed they'd checked into the Little River Inn on October 8th, the same day Sarah had submitted her report to the EPA. They'd checked out on October 16th, the day after Sarah was officially reported missing. When FBI agents attempted to interview these men, they discovered that Torres had died in a motorcycle accident in Nevada just weeks after Sarah's disappearance. Patterson had left the country, reportedly taking a security job in Eastern Europe. Kim claimed to have no memory of what he'd been doing in Mendocino, citing medical issues related to his military service. The investigation took an unexpected turn in January 2020, when Sarah's Honda Civic was discovered in a long-term parking lot at San Francisco International Airport. The car had been there since October 14th. According to parking records, though airport security cameras showed no record of Sarah entering the terminal, the car's discovery generated new hope that Sarah might have fled voluntarily, perhaps using the confusion around her disappearance to start a new life somewhere safe. But forensic analysis of the vehicle told a different story. The car had been wiped clean of fingerprints and DNA evidence, suggesting professional involvement. Sarah's personal belongings were gone, but investigators found traces of industrial chemicals in the trunk, the same chemicals that Redwood Industrial Solutions had been illegally dumping. David Crenshaw clung to the hope that Sarah was alive somewhere, living under a new identity, and waiting for the day it would be safe to return. She was smart, he told me during one of our conversations at the Harbor Cafe. If anyone could disappear completely and build a new life, it would be Sarah. Sometimes I imagine getting a postcard from some remote coastal town, just her signature and coordinates for a dive site she wants to show me. Dr. Whitmore was less optimistic. Sarah loved her research too much to abandon it, he said. She'd spent years building relationships with the scientific community, establishing her reputation. If she was alive and safe, she would have found a way to get her environmental findings published. The fact that her research died with her disappearance tells me that Sarah herself is gone. The FBI investigation ultimately resulted in federal charges against Marcus Reed and 5 other Redwood Industrial Solutions executives. The company was forced to pay $127 million in fines and cleanup costs, and Reed himself received a 10-year prison sentence for environmental crimes and conspiracy charges related to Sarah's disappearance. But the criminal convictions provided little comfort to those who had known and loved Sarah. The men directly responsible for her disappearance had vanished as completely as Sarah herself, protected by the same network of contacts and resources that had allowed them to operate with impunity for so many years. Vincent Kozlov was found dead in his Las Vegas apartment in March 2020, an apparent suicide by gunshot. He left behind a note apologizing to his family for the things I did for money, but provided no details about his specific crimes. His death closed off what investigators believed was their best chance of learning what had actually happened to Sarah Chen. As the second anniversary of Sarah's disappearance approached, new evidence emerged that would reshape the entire investigation. A former Redwood Industrial Solutions employee named Patricia Wong came forward with information she'd been too frightened to share during the initial FBI investigation. Wong had worked as an administrative assistant in the company's executive offices and had access to Marcus Reed's calendar and correspondence. She revealed that on October 11, 2019, the day after Sarah received the threatening phone call, Reed had held an emergency meeting with Vincent Kozlov and 3 outside contractors. I wasn't supposed to be in the office that evening, Wong told federal investigators, but I'd forgotten some files I needed for the next day. I could hear them talking in Mr. Reed's office, and what I heard terrified me. According to Wong, Reed had instructed Kozlov to make the researcher disappear permanently, and to clean up any loose ends that might connect back to the company. The conversation included discussion of locations where someone could be disposed of without leaving evidence, and specific plans for disposing of Sarah's car and personal belongings. Wong's testimony provided the missing link that federal prosecutors needed to file murder charges against Marcus Reed and his co-conspirators. But by the time arrest warrants were issued, Reed had fled the country, reportedly to a non-extradition jurisdiction in South America where he'd been moving money through shell companies for years. The revelation that Sarah had likely been murdered rather than simply disappeared brought some closure to her family and friends, but it also deepened their grief. The hope that she might someday return home was replaced by the terrible certainty that she'd died because she'd tried to protect the environment she loved. 4 years have passed since Sarah Chen disappeared from the coastal town that had become her home, but her presence lingers in Mendocino like the morning fog that rolls in from the Pacific. Her story has become part of the community's collective memory, a reminder of the price that truth-tellers sometimes pay in a world where corporate interests often outweigh individual lives. The cottage on Little Lake Road remains empty, though Robert Martinez has received dozens of inquiries from potential renters over the years. It doesn't feel right, he told me when I asked why he hasn't re-rented the property. Sarah loved that place, and it loved her back. Until we know for certain what happened to her, it should stay as it was when she lived there. The cottage has become an unofficial memorial to Sarah's memory. Margaret from the village store tends a small garden beside the front gate, planting the native coastal flowers that Sarah had admired during her morning walks. David Crenshaw stops by regularly to maintain the property, keeping the windows clean and the driveway clear of fallen branches from the towering redwoods. Inside the cottage, Sarah's presence is everywhere. Her books still line the shelves in the study, field guides to marine life, scientific journals, novels about the sea that she'd read during quiet evenings. Her diving equipment hangs in the closet, wetsuit and mask waiting for a dive that will never come. Robert has left everything exactly as Sarah arranged it, creating a time capsule of a life interrupted. The impact of Sarah's research extends far beyond Mendocino County. The environmental crimes she uncovered led to one of the largest environmental cleanup efforts in Northern California history. The contaminated waterways she'd identified have been restored, and the marine life populations she'd studied are slowly recovering. Dr. Whitmore completed Sarah's abalone research using the data she'd collected during her time in Mendocino. The resulting paper, published in the Journal of Marine Biology with Sarah listed as the primary author, has become one of the most cited studies in recent marine conservation literature. Sarah's work will influence environmental policy for generations, Dr. Whitmore told me. Her death was a tragedy, but her research lives on. The Sarah Chen Foundation for Environmental Protection, established by her parents, provides grants for young researchers studying coastal conservation. The foundation has funded dozens of research projects along the Pacific coast, continuing Sarah's work of documenting and protecting marine ecosystems. Each year, the foundation awards the Sarah Chen Memorial Fellowship to a graduate student, whose research shows the potential to make a significant environmental impact. Thomas and Linda Chen have aged visibly in the years since their daughter's disappearance, but they've channeled their grief into activism and advocacy. They speak regularly at conferences about the dangers faced by environmental researchers and the need for better protection of whistleblowers who expose corporate crimes. Sarah always said that the ocean doesn't recognize political boundaries or corporate interests, Linda Chen told me during our interview at their Sacramento home. She believed that protecting the environment was a moral imperative that transcended personal safety. We're trying to honor that belief by supporting other young people who share her passion for the truth. David Crenshaw has never stopped believing that Sarah might still be alive somewhere. He's followed up on dozens of reported sightings over the years. A woman matching Sarah's description spotted at a farmer's market in Oregon, a marine biologist working under an assumed name at a research station in Alaska, a diver exploring coral reefs in Hawaii who reminded someone of Sarah's photograph. None of these leads have produced evidence that Sarah survived her disappearance, but David continues to hope. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," he said during our last conversation at the harbor where they used to meet. "If anyone could survive what happened to her and build a new life, it would be Sarah. I keep thinking that someday I'll get a message from her, telling me she's safe and ready to come home." The Linda Marie, David's fishing boat, still carries equipment that Sarah had given him, an underwater camera for documenting unusual species, water testing kits for monitoring ocean chemistry, GPS coordinates for dive sites they'd explored together. David has continued Sarah's citizen science work, reporting his observations to researchers studying climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. Emily Rodriguez completed her environmental science degree and is now pursuing graduate studies in marine biology at UC San Diego. She credits Sarah with inspiring her career choice and her commitment to environmental protection. "Sarah showed me that science isn't just about collecting data," Emily told me. "It's about using that data to make the world a better place, even when that means taking risks." Emily has returned to Mendocino several times over the years, visiting the monitoring sites where she worked with Sarah and continuing some of the research they'd begun together. She's documenting the recovery of the marine ecosystems that Sarah had fought to protect, creating a record of how environmental restoration can succeed when corporate pollution is stopped. The broader scientific community has rallied around Sarah's memory and her research. The International Association of Marine Biologists established the Sarah Chen Award for Courage in Environmental Research, recognizing scientists who risk their safety to expose environmental crimes. The award has brought international attention to the dangers faced by environmental researchers around the world, But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Sarah's life is the gradual return of life to the waters she'd studied. The abalone populations and the monitoring sites she'd established are showing signs of recovery. Sea stars are thriving in tide pools that had been lifeless 4 years ago. The water quality in Brush Creek and other contaminated waterways has improved dramatically since Redwood Industrial Solutions was forced to cease operations. Margaret from the village store keeps a photograph of Sarah behind the counter, a candid shot taken during one of the summer festivals that bring tourists to Mendocino. In the photo, Sarah is laughing at something off camera, her face animated with joy and intelligence. Customers sometimes ask about the photograph, and Margaret tells them Sarah's story, ensuring that her memory remains alive in the community she'd grown to love. She was going to make a difference. Margaret always concludes her stories about Sarah, and in the end she did make a difference, even though it cost her everything. That's the kind of person Sarah was. She couldn't stand by and watch the ocean be destroyed, even when speaking up put her in danger. David Crenshaw has never stopped believing that Sarah might still be alive somewhere. He's followed up on dozens of reported sightings over the years. A woman matching Sarah's description spotted at a farmer's market in Oregon, a marine biologist working under an assumed name at a research station in Alaska, a diver exploring coral reefs in Hawaii, who reminded someone of Sarah's photograph. None of these leads have produced evidence that Sarah survived her disappearance, but David continues to hope. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," he said during our last conversation at the harbor where they used to meet. "If anyone could survive what happened to her and build a new life, it would be Sarah. I keep thinking that someday I'll get a message from her, telling me she's safe and ready to come home." The Linda Marie, David's fishing boat, still carries equipment that Sarah had given him, an underwater camera for documenting unusual species, water testing kits for monitoring ocean chemistry, GPS coordinates for dive sites they'd explored together. David has continued Sarah's citizen science work, reporting his observations to researchers studying climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. Emily Rodriguez completed her environmental science degree and is now pursuing graduate studies in marine biology at UC San Diego. She credits Sarah with inspiring her career choice and her commitment to environmental protection. "Sarah showed me that science isn't just about collecting data," Emily told me. "It's about using that data to make the world a better place, even when that means taking risks." Emily has returned to Mendocino several times over the years, visiting the monitoring sites where she worked with Sarah and continuing some of the research they'd begun together. She's documenting the recovery of the marine ecosystems that Sarah had fought to protect, creating a record of how environmental restoration can succeed when corporate pollution is stopped. The broader scientific community has rallied around Sarah's memory and her research. The International Association of Marine Biologists established the Sarah Chen Award for Courage in Environmental Research, recognizing scientists who risk their safety to expose environmental crimes. The award has brought international attention to the dangers faced by environmental researchers around the world. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Sarah's life is the gradual return of life to the waters she'd studied. The abalone populations and the monitoring sites she'd established are showing signs of recovery. Sea stars are thriving in tide pools that had been lifeless 4 years ago. The water quality in Brush Creek and other contaminated waterways has improved dramatically since Redwood Industrial Solutions was forced to cease operations. Margaret from the village store keeps a photograph of Sarah behind the counter, a candid shot taken during one of the summer festivals that bring tourists to Mendocino. In the photo, Sarah is laughing at something off camera, her face animated with joy and intelligence. Customers sometimes ask about the photograph, and Margaret tells them Sarah's story, ensuring that her memory remains alive in the community she'd grown to love. She was going to make a difference. Margaret always concludes her stories about Sarah, and in the end she did make a difference, even though it cost her everything. That's the kind of person Sarah was. She couldn't stand by and watch the ocean be destroyed, even when speaking up put her in danger. As we near the end of Sarah's story, there are still questions that may never be answered. Despite years of investigation by local, state, and federal authorities, Sarah's body has never been found. The men directly responsible for her disappearance have vanished as completely as Sarah herself, taking their secrets with them to graves scattered across the world. Detective Frank Morrison, now retired, still thinks about the case regularly. He keeps Sarah's file on his desk at home, occasionally reviewing the evidence and looking for connections he might have missed. In 30 years of law enforcement, "I've never had a case affect me the way Sarah's did," he told me. "She was trying to do the right thing, and she paid the ultimate price for it." Cases like that stay with you. Morrison believes that Sarah was murdered within 24 hours of her disappearance, probably on October 14th or 15th, 2019. The professional nature of the operation, the clean removal of evidence, the disposal of her car, the complete elimination of any forensic traces, suggests military or intelligence-level expertise in making people disappear. The men who took Sarah weren't street criminals, Morrison explained. They were professionals who'd done this kind of work before. They knew how to make someone vanish without leaving evidence, and they had the resources to cover their tracks completely. The FBI investigation concluded that Sarah's body was most likely disposed of in the Pacific Ocean, weighted down in deep water where it would never be recovered. The rugged Mendocino coastline offers hundreds of locations where someone could be taken out to sea and never found. The same ocean that Sarah had dedicated her life to studying became her final resting place. But David Crenshaw has never accepted this conclusion. He's spent countless hours searching remote beaches and hidden coves along the coast, looking for any sign that Sarah might have survived her abduction. His knowledge of the local waters, gained through a lifetime of fishing, has taken him to places that official search teams never explored. The ocean gives up its secrets eventually. David told me during one of our walks along the bluffs where Sarah used to collect data, bodies wash ashore, debris surfaces, currents carry things back to land. If Sarah was in the water, we would have found something by now. The fact that we haven't found anything makes me think she might still be out there somewhere. There have been tantalizing hints over the years that Sarah might have survived. A marine biologist working at a research station in British Columbia bore a striking resemblance to Sarah's photographs, but she turned out to be a Canadian citizen with no connection to the case. Security footage from a ferry terminal in Washington state showed a woman who walked like Sarah and had similar hair, but the image was too unclear for positive identification. More intriguingly, there have been reports of someone continuing Sarah's research in remote locations along the Pacific coast. Water quality data has been anonymously submitted to environmental agencies, documenting pollution in areas where no official monitoring programs exist. The data collection methods and analysis techniques are identical to those Sarah used during her time in Mendocino. Dr. Whitmore has received several packages over the years containing marine specimens and detailed observation notes, always postmarked from different locations and with no return address. The handwriting doesn't match Sarah's, but the scientific methodology and attention to detail are remarkably similar to her approach. Part of me wants to believe that Sarah found a way to escape and is continuing her work under a new identity, Dr. Whitmore admitted during our interview. The data that's been submitted anonymously is exactly the kind of research Sarah would be conducting if she was still alive, but I know that's probably wishful thinking. The more likely explanation is that other researchers have been inspired by Sarah's work and are continuing it in her memory. The mystery deepened in 2022 when a package arrived at the Sarah Chen Foundation, containing $50,000 in cash, and a handwritten note that simply read, "For the abalone." The money was used to fund a major restoration project at Sarah's original monitoring sites, but efforts to trace the donation's source were unsuccessful. The handwriting on the note was analyzed by forensic experts, but it didn't match any samples in law enforcement databases. The paper was generic office stock available at thousands of retailers, and the envelope bore no distinguishing marks. Like so many aspects of Sarah's case, the donation raised more questions than it answered. Thomas and Linda Chen have made peace with the uncertainty surrounding their daughter's fate. They've chosen to focus on the positive impact of Sarah's work, rather than dwelling on the circumstances of her disappearance. "We may never know exactly what happened to Sarah," Linda told me, "but we know that her research is still making a difference. Every time we fund a new fellowship or support a conservation project, a part of Sarah lives on." The Chens have visited Mendocino several times over the years, staying in a bed and breakfast near the cottage where Sarah lived. They've walked the beaches where she conducted her research, visited the tide pools she studied, and met with the people who knew and loved their daughter during her time in the coastal community. "Mendocino gave Sarah something she'd never found anywhere else," Thomas Chen observed. "She found a purpose there, a cause worth fighting for, and people who appreciated her dedication to protecting the environment. In a way, she's still there, in the work that continues and the memory that endures." As the years pass, Sarah Chen's disappearance has become part of the folklore of Mendocino County, a story passed down among residents and retold to visitors who ask about the empty cottage on Little Lake Road. But for those who knew her personally, Sarah remains a vivid presence, her passion for marine conservation inspiring a new generation of environmental researchers. The cottage where Sarah lived has been designated as a historical landmark by the Mendocino Heritage Foundation, ensuring that it will be preserved as a memorial to her life and work. Plans are underway to convert the property into a research station where visiting scientists can study the marine ecosystems that Sarah fought to protect. Sarah believed that the truth would always surface eventually, like a message in a bottle washing up on shore, Dr. Whitmore reflected. Maybe someday we'll learn what really happened to her. But even if we don't, her legacy is secure. The ocean is cleaner because of her work, and the environment is better protected because of her courage. And so we come to the end of Sarah Chen's story. Though in many ways, her story continues every day. It continues in the graduate students who receive fellowships in her name, in the restored tide pools where marine life is thriving again, and the stricter environmental regulations that prevent other companies from following Redwood Industrial Solutions' destructive path. Sarah's disappearance remains officially unsolved, but her impact on the world is undeniable. She came to Mendocino as a young researcher studying abalone decline, and discovered something much larger, a systematic assault on the marine environment that she couldn't ignore, even when fighting it cost her everything. Tonight, as the rain falls gently outside your window, picture the Mendocino coast as Sarah knew it. Imagine the fog rolling in from the Pacific, carrying the salt smell of the ocean and the sound of waves against the rocky shore. Think of the tide pools she explored, now teeming with life thanks to the protection her research provided. Whether Sarah Chen is resting somewhere beneath the Pacific waves she loved so much, or living quietly under a new name in some distant coastal town, her work continues. Every time someone chooses to protect the environment despite personal risk, every time a researcher exposes corporate wrongdoing, despite the potential consequences, Sarah's courage lives on. The cottage on Little Lake Road sits peacefully in the redwood forest, waiting for the day when its mysteries might finally be revealed. But until that day comes, it stands as a testament to a young woman who believed that the truth was worth any sacrifice, and that the ocean's health was more important than her own safety. Let Sarah's story remind you that individual actions can make a difference, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names we never learn, whose sacrifices we never fully understand. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let the sound of falling rain carry away your worries and concerns. Let it wash over you like the Pacific waves that Sarah loved so much, bringing peace and rest, and the gentle promise that tomorrow brings new possibilities for making the world a better place. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the world, researchers like Sarah continue their work, protecting the environment and seeking truth despite the risks. But if you're still awake and listening, please don't forget to comment where you're listening from, and the current time in your corner of the world. Also be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Amy Lynn Bradley was born on May 12, 1974, in Petersburg, Virginia, a historic city nestled along the Appomattox River about 25 miles south of Richmond. Petersburg, with its cobblestone streets and Civil War battlefields, was the kind of place where families knew each other for generations, where children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and where young people often dreamed of adventures beyond the city limits. Amy was the daughter of Ron and Iva Bradley, hard-working parents who had built a comfortable middle-class life in their colonial home on a tree-lined street. Ron worked as a computer technician, methodical and detail-oriented, while Iva dedicated herself to raising their 2 children. Amy's younger brother, Brad, was her constant companion growing up, and the siblings shared the kind of bond that made them more like best friends than brother and sister. By all accounts, Amy was a remarkable young woman, standing 5'7" with shoulder-length brown hair and striking green eyes. She possessed a natural beauty that turned heads wherever she went. But it wasn't just her appearance that made Amy special. She had a magnetic personality that drew people to her. Friends described her as vivacious, kind-hearted, and fiercely loyal. She was the type of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who would drive across town to help a friend in need, and who could light up a room simply by walking into it. Amy had always been academically gifted. She graduated from Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia, with a degree in physical education, harboring dreams of becoming a teacher and coach. She was particularly passionate about basketball, having played throughout high school and college. Her teammates remembered her as someone who never gave up, who encouraged others, and who brought out the best in everyone around her. In March of 1998, Amy was 23 years old, and working at a local fitness center while planning her next steps. She had recently ended a long-term relationship, and was in that transitional phase of early adulthood where the whole world seemed full of possibilities. When her parents suggested a family cruise vacation, Amy jumped at the chance. It would be a perfect opportunity to spend quality time with her family, while taking a break from the stresses of post-college life. The Bradley family had never taken a cruise before, but the idea of a Caribbean adventure appealed to all of them. They booked passage on the Rhapsody of the Seas, a Royal Caribbean cruise ship that promised 7 days of luxury and relaxation. The itinerary would take them from San Juan, Puerto Rico, to various Caribbean ports including Aruba, Curaçao, and St. Martin, exotic destinations that seemed like something out of a travel magazine. The Rhapsody of the Seas was no ordinary vessel. Launched in 1997, it was one of Royal Caribbean's newest and most impressive ships at the time, stretching 915 feet in length, and capable of carrying over 2,400 passengers. With its gleaming white hull and multiple decks filled with restaurants, bars, pools, and entertainment venues, it was essentially a floating city. On March 21, 1998, the Bradley family, Ron, Eva, Amy, and Brad, boarded the ship in San Juan, Puerto Rico. San Juan, with its colorful colonial architecture and fortress walls overlooking the Atlantic, provided a stunning backdrop for the beginning of their adventure. The family was excited and optimistic as they explored their home for the next week, marveling at the ship's amenities and the endless ocean stretching to the horizon. Amy quickly embraced cruise life. She was naturally social and made friends easily with other passengers and crew members alike. The ship's crew, many of whom were from Caribbean nations, were drawn to Amy's friendly demeanor and genuine interest in learning about their cultures and home countries. She spent hours talking with various staff members, asking about their lives, their families, and their experiences working on cruise ships. The first few days of the cruise passed without incident. The family visited the Dutch island of Aruba, with its pristine white sand beaches and crystal-clear turquoise waters. They explored the historic Willemstad in Curaçao, with its distinctive pastel-colored buildings and floating market. Amy documented their adventures with her camera, capturing moments of joy and family bonding that would later become precious memories. But it was Amy's interactions with the ship's crew that would later become a crucial part of the investigation. She struck up conversations with numerous staff members, including a band member known as Yellow, who played in the ship's house band. Yellow, whose real name was Alistair Douglas, was a musician from Barbados who had been working cruise ships for several years. Amy found him charming and enjoyed listening to stories about his musical career and life in the Caribbean. Amy also befriended several other crew members, including waiters, housekeeping staff, and entertainers. Her brother Brad later recalled that Amy had a gift for making people feel comfortable and valued, regardless of their job or background. She treated everyone with the same kindness and respect, from fellow passengers to the crew members who cleaned their cabin. On the evening of March 23rd, the ship docked in Curaçao, a Dutch Caribbean island known for its stunning coral reefs and vibrant underwater life. The Bradley family spent the day exploring the island, shopping in the floating market, and enjoying the warm Caribbean sun. Amy seemed particularly enchanted by the island's beauty and took numerous photographs of the colorful architecture and tropical landscapes. That evening, back on the ship, Amy decided to join some new friends at the ship's disco. The Rhapsody of the Seas featured several bars and nightclubs, and the disco was a popular spot for younger passengers to dance and socialize. Amy, who loved music and dancing, was in her element. She spent the evening laughing, dancing, and enjoying the company of other passengers and some crew members. It was during this evening that Amy was again seen talking with Yellow and other members of the ship's band. Witnesses later reported that Amy seemed to be having a good time, though some noted that she appeared to have been drinking. This wasn't unusual. Cruise ships are known for their liberal alcohol policies and party atmosphere, but it would later become a point of focus in the investigation. As the evening wore on, Amy's brother Brad joined her at the disco. The siblings enjoyed dancing together and catching up with some of the friends they had made during the cruise. Brad later described Amy as being in good spirits, though he noticed she had been drinking throughout the evening. Around 1 a.m. on March 24th, Brad decided he was ready to call it a night, and suggested that Amy come back to their cabin with him. Amy, however, wasn't ready to end her evening. She told Brad she wanted to stay a little longer, and would return to their cabin shortly. This was typical behavior for Amy. She was an adult who could take care of herself, and the ship seemed like a safe environment. Brad said goodnight to his sister, and headed back to the family's cabin on Deck 9. This would be the last time anyone in the Bradley family would see Amy Lynn Bradley alive. What happened in the hours between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m. on March 24, 1998, remains one of the most puzzling aspects of Amy's disappearance. The timeline of events, reconstructed from witness statements and security footage, paints a picture of a young woman enjoying her vacation who simply vanished into thin air. After Brad left the disco around 1 a.m., Amy remained at the venue with several other passengers and crew members. Multiple witnesses reported seeing her throughout the early morning hours, though accounts of her behavior and level of intoxication varied. Some described her as having a good time and appearing normal, while others suggested she seemed more intoxicated than usual. Around 3:30 a.m., Amy was seen leaving the disco with Yellow, the band member she had befriended earlier in the cruise. Several passengers reported seeing them together in the hallway outside the disco, and at least one witness claimed to have seen them in an elevator together. This sighting would later become crucial to the investigation, though Yellow would maintain that he simply helped Amy back toward her cabin area and left her there. Security cameras throughout the ship captured various images of Amy during these early morning hours, though the footage was grainy and sometimes inconclusive. The ship's security system in 1998 was not as sophisticated as modern systems, and many areas of the ship were not covered by cameras at all. The footage that did exist showed Amy in various locations throughout the ship, but did not provide a clear picture of her final movements. At approximately 5:15 a.m., Amy was reportedly seen by a fellow passenger in the ship's casino. The witness, a middle-aged woman from Ohio, later told investigators that she noticed Amy because she seemed somewhat disoriented and was asking for directions back to her cabin. The woman offered to help Amy find her way, but Amy declined and said she could manage on her own. This sighting in the casino was significant because it placed Amy in a different area of the ship than where she had last been seen with Yellow. The casino was located on Deck 5, while the Bradley family cabin was on Deck 9, and the disco was on Deck 6. If the sighting was accurate, it suggested that Amy had been moving around the ship extensively during the early morning hours. Around 5:30 a.m., Amy was allegedly seen one final time by a ship's crew member who was preparing for the morning shift. The crew member, a housekeeper from the Philippines, reported seeing a young woman matching Amy's description sitting alone on a lounge chair on Deck 5, near the ship's pool area. The woman appeared to be sleeping or resting, and the crew member did not disturb her, assuming she was a passenger who had stayed up late partying and was taking a break before returning to her cabin. This final sighting was never definitively confirmed to be Amy, as the lighting was poor and the crew member only glimpsed the person briefly. However, the timing and location made it significant to investigators trying to piece together Amy's final movements. At 6 a.m. sharp, as was his habit, Ron Bradley woke up in the family cabin on Deck 9. Ron was an early riser who enjoyed watching the sunrise from their cabin's balcony, and he had done this every morning of their cruise. The family had booked a cabin with a private balcony, which offered stunning views of the Caribbean Sea and whatever islands they might be passing. As Ron stepped onto the balcony to enjoy his morning coffee and watch the sunrise, he expected to find the cabin quiet, with his wife and 2 children still sleeping. Eva was in the bed closest to the balcony. Brad was sleeping on the sofa bed, but Amy's bed was empty. Her bed appeared to have been slept in, the covers were disturbed, and her pillow showed an indentation, but Amy was nowhere to be seen. Initially, Ron wasn't overly concerned. Amy was an adult, and it wasn't entirely unusual for young people on cruises to stay up all night partying, and then sleep in common areas or friends' cabins. He assumed she might have fallen asleep somewhere else on the ship and would return shortly. He decided to let his wife and son continue sleeping, and enjoyed his coffee while watching the sun rise over the Caribbean waters. As the morning progressed, and Amy still hadn't returned, Ron began to feel the first stirrings of concern. By 7 a.m., he decided to wake up Eva and Brad to see if they knew where Amy might be. Both were surprised that Amy hadn't returned to the cabin, but like Ron, they initially assumed there was a reasonable explanation. Brad volunteered to search the ship for his sister, beginning with the areas where she was most likely to be found. He checked the disco, which was now closed and being cleaned by the crew. He visited the various restaurants and cafes where the family had eaten during the cruise. He even checked the ship's fitness center, knowing Amy's love of exercise and sports. As Brad searched, Ron and Ava began asking other passengers if they had seen Amy. They approached the friends Amy had made during the cruise, the couple from Texas who had shared a table with them at dinner, and various other passengers who might have seen her the night before. The responses were mixed. Some remembered seeing Amy at the disco, but no one had seen her since the early morning hours. By 9 a.m., the Bradley family's concern had turned to serious worry. Amy had never disappeared like this before, and it was completely out of character for her not to return to the cabin, or at least let someone know where she was. Ron made the decision to contact ship security and report Amy as missing. This decision would mark the beginning of one of the most extensive and controversial missing person investigations in maritime history. When Ron Bradley approached the ship's security office at 9:30 a.m. on March 24, 1998, he was met with what many families of missing persons experience: initial skepticism and bureaucratic obstacles. The head of security, a veteran cruise ship employee who had dealt with numerous passenger incidents over the years, initially treated Amy's disappearance as a routine matter. "These things happen on cruise ships," the security chief told Ron. "Young people party too hard, fall asleep somewhere, sometimes they even fall overboard, but usually turn up by lunch." His casual attitude would later become a source of tremendous frustration and anger for the Bradley family, who felt that precious time was wasted in those crucial first hours. Despite the security chief's initial dismissive attitude, standard protocol required a ship-wide search when a passenger was reported missing. The Rhapsody of the Seas carried a crew of approximately 760 people, and a systematic search of a ship that size was a significant undertaking. The search began around 10 a.m., with crew members checking every public area, storage room, restaurant, bar, and accessible space on all 15 decks of the vessel. The search teams were thorough and professional. They checked the ship's library, where Amy might have gone to read or rest quietly. They examined every lounge chair around the pools, thinking she might have fallen asleep sunbathing. They searched the fitness center, the spa, the casino, and even the ship's medical facility, in case Amy had been injured or had fallen ill during the night. As the search progressed, Ron, Iva, and Brad Bradley found themselves in an agonizing state of limbo. They wandered the ship's corridors, asking every passenger and crew member they encountered if they had seen Amy. The family distributed a recent photograph of Amy, a beautiful shot of her smiling on the ship's deck, her brown hair catching the Caribbean sunlight, and begged anyone who had seen her to come forward. The ship's passengers, many of whom were now aware that someone was missing, were generally helpful and sympathetic. Several people remembered seeing Amy at various times during the cruise, and a few recalled seeing her at the disco the night before. But as the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that no one had seen Amy since the early morning hours. By noon, the search had expanded to include areas of the ship that were normally off-limits to passengers. Crew quarters, storage areas, mechanical rooms, and service corridors were all systematically checked. The search teams looked in places where someone might hide, or where an injured person might have sought help, or where someone might have accidentally fallen or become trapped. One of the most disturbing possibilities that had to be considered was that Amy might have fallen overboard. The Rhapsody of the Seas, like all cruise ships, had safety railings around all passenger decks, but it was theoretically possible for someone to accidentally or intentionally go over the side. The ship's wake, and the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, made such a scenario almost certainly fatal. The ship's officers began reviewing security camera footage from the previous night, looking for any clues about Amy's movements or what might have happened to her. The footage was grainy and incomplete. Many areas of the ship were not covered by cameras in 1998, but it did show Amy in various locations throughout the early morning hours of March 24th. The security team also began interviewing crew members who had worked the late shift, asking if anyone had seen Amy or noticed anything unusual during the night. This process revealed that several crew members remembered Amy from earlier in the cruise, as she had been particularly friendly and outgoing with the ship's staff. Yellow, the band member who had been seen with Amy the night before, was among the first crew members interviewed. He acknowledged spending time with Amy during the cruise, and confirmed that he had been with her at the disco on the night she disappeared. However, he maintained that he had simply helped her find her way back toward her cabin area, around 4 a.m., and had left her there when she said she could make it back on her own. Yellow's account would become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the early investigation. Some passengers reported seeing Amy and Yellow together at various times during the cruise, and their interaction on the final night was well documented by multiple witnesses. However, Yellow consistently denied any involvement in Amy's disappearance and cooperated with the ship's security investigation. As the afternoon wore on, the reality of the situation began to sink in for everyone aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas. Amy Lynn Bradley, a vibrant 23-year-old woman, who had been laughing and dancing just hours before, had simply vanished. There was no evidence of foul play, no signs of an accident, no indication of where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. The ship's captain, who had been monitoring the search efforts throughout the day, faced a difficult decision. The Rhapsody of the Seas was scheduled to dock in Barbados the following morning, and there were over 2,000 other passengers whose vacation plans had to be considered. At the same time, a young woman was missing, possibly somewhere on his ship, and her distraught family was begging for more time to find her. At 4 p.m., after 6 hours of intensive searching, the ship's security chief delivered devastating news to the Bradley family. Despite checking every accessible area of the ship, interviewing dozens of crew members and passengers, and reviewing available security footage, they had found no trace of Amy Lynn Bradley. "We've done everything we can," the security chief told Ron and Iva Bradley. "If she were anywhere on this ship, we would have found her by now." The implication was clear, though no one wanted to say it out loud. Amy had somehow left the ship, either voluntarily or involuntarily, and was no longer aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas. The morning of March 25, 1998, found the Rhapsody of the Seas docking in Bridgetown, Barbados as scheduled. For most of the 2,400 passengers aboard, it was another exciting day of their Caribbean vacation. For the Bradley family, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would consume their lives for decades to come. Barbados, with its pink sand beaches and colonial architecture, should have been a tropical paradise. Instead, it became the launching point for an international investigation that would span multiple countries, involve numerous law enforcement agencies, and generate thousands of leads that ultimately led nowhere. Ron and Eva Bradley had barely slept during the night, clinging to the desperate hope that Amy might somehow still be found aboard the ship. When the morning brought no new developments, they faced the heartbreaking reality that their daughter was gone. The ship's security team had exhausted all possibilities aboard the vessel, and now the focus shifted to what might have happened to Amy on land. The Bradley family's first priority was contacting law enforcement. In Barbados, this meant dealing with the Royal Barbados Police Force, a professional organization that nonetheless had limited experience with international missing person cases involving cruise ships. The cultural and bureaucratic differences between the American family and the Caribbean authorities created immediate challenges that would complicate the investigation for years to come. While Ron and Eva dealt with local police, Brad Bradley took on the heartbreaking task of calling family members back in Virginia to tell them what had happened. These phone calls, to grandparents, aunts, uncles, and close family friends, were among the most difficult conversations of Brad's life. How do you explain that your sister has simply vanished without a trace in the middle of the ocean? The news of Amy's disappearance spread quickly through their hometown of Petersburg, Virginia. Amy had been popular and well known in the community, and word of her disappearance shocked everyone who knew her. Friends organized prayer vigils, while others began calling the Bradley family to offer support and assistance. Meanwhile, aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas, crew members were being interviewed more extensively by both ship security and Barbadian police officers who had boarded the vessel. The interviews revealed a complex web of relationships and interactions between Amy and various crew members, but no clear evidence of what had happened to her. Yellow, the band member, continued to maintain his innocence and cooperated fully with investigators. However, some passengers reported that they had seen Yellow and other crew members acting nervously on the morning Amy was discovered missing. These observations, while not necessarily significant, added to the growing suspicion that someone aboard the ship knew more than they were saying. The FBI became involved in the case within 48 hours of Amy's disappearance, as American citizens who go missing in international waters fall under federal jurisdiction. Special agents flew from the FBI's field office in San Juan, Puerto Rico, to Barbados to begin their own investigation. The involvement of the FBI brought professional resources and international reach that local authorities could not provide, but it also added another layer of complexity to an already complicated case. FBI Special Agent Ron Ram, who would become the lead investigator on Amy's case, was an experienced agent with expertise in international crimes and missing person cases. He immediately recognized that the Amy Bradley case presented unique challenges due to its maritime setting, international scope, and the large number of potential witnesses and suspects from different countries. Agent Ram's first priority was interviewing the Bradley family to get a complete picture of Amy's background, behavior, and activities during the cruise. These interviews revealed that Amy was not the type of person who would voluntarily disappear or abandon her family. She was close to her parents and brother, had no serious personal problems, and had been looking forward to returning home to start her teaching career. The FBI also began the painstaking process of interviewing passengers and crew members from the Rhapsody of the Seas. With over 2,400 passengers from dozens of countries and a crew of 760 people from around the world, this was an enormous undertaking that would take weeks to complete and years to follow up on. One of the most significant developments in the early FBI investigation was the discovery that several crew members had been asking passengers about Amy before her disappearance was officially reported. According to witness statements, some crew members had been inquiring about Amy's whereabouts and asking other passengers if they had seen her, apparently before the Bradley family had even contacted ship security. This revelation raised troubling questions about what certain crew members might have known about Amy's disappearance and when they knew it. If crew members were looking for Amy before she was officially reported missing, it suggested that something had happened to her earlier than anyone had initially believed. The FBI also discovered that some crew members had been observed cleaning areas of the ship more thoroughly than usual on the morning of March 24th. While this could have been coincidental routine maintenance, it raised concerns about potential evidence being destroyed or crime scenes being contaminated. As the investigation expanded, Agent Ram began to develop theories about what might have happened to Amy. The three main possibilities were accidental death falling overboard, suicide, or foul play. Given Amy's personality and behavior during the cruise, both suicide and accidental death seemed unlikely, which left the most disturbing possibility that Amy had been the victim of a crime. The question of foul play opened up numerous possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Had Amy been assaulted and then disposed of overboard to cover up the crime? Had she been kidnapped and taken off the ship in Curacao or Barbados? Had she been the victim of human trafficking, sold into modern slavery in some distant country? These possibilities seemed almost too terrible to contemplate, but they had to be considered as the investigation progressed. The FBI began working with international law enforcement agencies, including Interpol, to expand the search for Amy beyond the Caribbean. As the Rhapsody of the Seas prepared to leave Barbados and continue its cruise schedule, the Bradley family faced an agonizing decision. Should they remain in Barbados to continue searching for Amy, or should they return to Virginia to organize search efforts from home? Either choice felt like abandoning their daughter, but staying in Barbados indefinitely was not practical or necessarily helpful. Ultimately, Ron and Iva Bradley decided to return to Virginia, but not before making a promise that would define the rest of their lives. They vowed that they would never stop looking for Amy, never stop investigating her disappearance, and never stop believing that she might still be alive somewhere in the world. This promise would transform them from a quiet middle-class family into tireless advocates for missing persons, international investigators, and experts on human trafficking and maritime crime. Their search for Amy would take them to dozens of countries, cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and consume their lives for more than 2 decades. But on that March morning in Barbados, as they boarded a plane back to Virginia without their daughter, Ron and Iva Bradley could never have imagined the journey that lay ahead of them. Back in Petersburg, Virginia, the Bradley home on Beechwood Avenue became the unofficial headquarters for one of the longest-running missing person investigations in American history. What had once been a quiet suburban house filled with family photos and comfortable furniture was transformed into a command center with maps of the Caribbean pinned to walls, filing cabinets full of tips and leads, and telephone lines that rang constantly with calls from psychics, investigators, and people claiming to have seen Amy. Ron Bradley, the methodical computer technician, applied his analytical skills to organizing every piece of information related to Amy's disappearance. He created detailed timelines, maintained extensive databases of witnesses and suspects, and methodically followed up on every lead, no matter how unlikely it seemed. Iva Bradley handled correspondence with law enforcement agencies, missing person organizations, and the hundreds of people who reached out to offer help or information. The FBI investigation, led by Special Agent Ron Ram, continued to expand in scope and complexity. Agents interviewed hundreds of passengers from the Rhapsody of the Seas, tracking them down in cities across America and around the world. Many passengers were cooperative and provided detailed statements about their interactions with Amy and observations from the cruise. Others were less helpful, either because they hadn't noticed anything significant or because they were reluctant to get involved in a criminal investigation. The crew member interviews proved more challenging. Many of the ship's staff were foreign nationals who had returned to their home countries after completing their contracts. The FBI had to work through international law enforcement channels to locate and interview crew members in countries throughout the Caribbean, South America, and Eastern Europe. Yellow, whose real name was Alistair Douglas, remained a person of interest in the investigation. He had returned to his native Barbados after completing his contract on the Rhapsody of the Seas, and FBI agents conducted multiple interviews with him there. Douglas continued to maintain his innocence and insisted that he had simply helped Amy find her way back to her cabin area on the night she disappeared. However, other evidence began to emerge that cast doubt on Douglas's account. Several passengers reported seeing him and Amy together at various times during the cruise, and some described their interactions as more intimate than Douglas had initially acknowledged. There were also reports that Douglas had been asking other passengers about Amy's whereabouts before her disappearance was officially reported, which raised questions about what he might have known. As the investigation progressed, disturbing new theories began to emerge about what might have happened to Amy. The FBI learned that cruise ships, despite their reputation as safe family vacation destinations, were actually frequent targets for human trafficking operations. The ship's international routes, mixed populations, and complex jurisdictional issues made them attractive to criminal organizations involved in the modern slave trade. The Caribbean region, in particular, was known to be a hub for human trafficking operations. Young women were regularly kidnapped or lured into prostitution rings that moved them between islands and countries, making them nearly impossible to track or rescue. The possibility that Amy had been targeted by such an operation was both horrifying and unfortunately plausible. This theory gained credibility when the FBI learned about several suspicious incidents involving other young women on Caribbean cruises. In the months following Amy's disappearance, there were reports of women being approached by crew members with offers of special tours or private parties on various islands. Some women reported feeling drugged or disoriented after accepting drinks from crew members, though none had actually disappeared. The Bradley family became advocates for cruise ship safety, working with congressional representatives to push for better security measures and more thorough background checks for crew members. They learned that many cruise ship employees came from countries with limited law enforcement infrastructure, making it difficult to verify their backgrounds or criminal histories. Meanwhile, tips and sightings began pouring in from around the world. The Bradley family received hundreds of phone calls from people who claimed to have seen Amy in various locations throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Each tip had to be investigated, no matter how unlikely it seemed, because the alternative, giving up hope, was unthinkable for Amy's family. Some of the sightings seemed credible. An American tourist in Curacao reported seeing a young woman matching Amy's description being forced into a car by several men just days after the cruise ship had docked there. A bartender in Aruba claimed that a woman matching Amy's description had asked him for help, saying she was being held against her will, before being quickly escorted away by two men. Other sightings were more questionable, but still had to be investigated. Psychics called claiming to have visions of Amy in various locations. Well-meaning tourists reported seeing young women who bore a passing resemblance to Amy in restaurants, hotels, and beaches throughout the Caribbean. Each report required follow-up, verification, and often expensive travel to investigate. The most significant and disturbing lead came in August 1998, 4 months after Amy's disappearance. A U.S. Navy sailor stationed at the Roosevelt Roads Naval Station in Puerto Rico contacted the FBI with a shocking claim. He said that while on shore leave in Curaçao, he had been approached by a young woman who said her name was Amy Bradley and that she was being held against her will. According to the sailor's account, the woman begged him to help her and said she had been kidnapped from a cruise ship. Before he could respond or get more information, the woman was quickly pulled away by several men who appeared to be her captors. The sailor said he tried to follow them, but lost them in the crowded streets of Willemstad. This sighting was taken very seriously by the FBI because the sailor had no apparent motive to lie and provided specific details that matched Amy's appearance and circumstances. Agents flew to Puerto Rico to interview the sailor extensively, and he passed a polygraph test. The account was detailed and consistent, and the sailor was able to provide information about the woman's appearance that had not been publicly released. The Curaçao sighting led to an intensive investigation on the island, with FBI agents working closely with Dutch authorities to search for Amy and identify potential human trafficking operations. They interviewed dozens of people, searched numerous buildings, and followed up on every possible lead, but found no trace of Amy or evidence to support the sailor's account. As 1998 turned into 1999, the Amy Bradley case had become one of the FBI's most resource-intensive missing person investigations. Hundreds of agents had worked on various aspects of the case, thousands of hours had been spent on interviews and evidence analysis, and the investigation had expanded to include multiple countries and law enforcement agencies. Yet despite all these efforts, Amy Lynn Bradley remained missing, and her family was no closer to understanding what had happened to her on that March morning, when she vanished from the Rhapsody of the Seas. In January 1999, nearly 10 months after Amy's disappearance, the Bradley family received what would become one of the most controversial and disturbing pieces of evidence in their daughter's case. An anonymous email arrived in their inbox containing 2 grainy photographs that would change the entire trajectory of the investigation and give them hope that Amy might still be alive. The photographs appeared to show a young woman with brown hair who bore a striking resemblance to Amy Lynn Bradley. In the images, the woman appeared to be in distress, and the setting looked like it could be somewhere in the Caribbean or Central America. The woman's facial features, body type, and distinctive birthmark on her shoulder seemed to match Amy's physical characteristics perfectly. The Bradley family was both hopeful and horrified by these photographs. If they truly showed Amy, it meant she was alive but in a terrible situation. Ron and Iva immediately contacted the FBI, and Special Agent Ron Ram launched an intensive investigation to determine the photographs' authenticity and origin. The FBI's technical analysis of the photographs was inconclusive. The images were heavily pixelated and appeared to have been taken with a low-quality camera or possibly extracted from video footage. Digital forensics experts examined every pixel looking for evidence of manipulation or editing, but could not definitively determine whether the photographs were genuine or fabricated. More disturbing photographs surfaced over the following months, each accompanied by anonymous messages claiming that Amy was being held in various locations throughout the Caribbean and Central America. Some images appeared to show the same woman in different settings, sometimes what looked like a brothel, other times appearing to be held in private residences or boats. The psychological toll on the Bradley family was enormous. Each new photograph brought a surge of hope that Amy was alive, followed by the crushing realization that if the images were genuine, their daughter was living in unimaginable circumstances. Ron and Iva found themselves analyzing every detail of each photograph, looking for clues about Amy's location or condition. The FBI expanded their investigation to include digital crime specialists and experts in human trafficking. They worked with international law enforcement agencies to trace the origin of the anonymous emails and photographs, but the senders had used sophisticated methods to hide their identities and locations. Some law enforcement officials began to suspect that the photographs might be part of an elaborate hoax or extortion attempt. The timing of their release, always when media attention on Amy's case was beginning to fade, seemed suspicious. Additionally, the anonymous senders never demanded money or made specific requests, which was unusual for typical extortion schemes. However, the Bradley family and many investigators remained convinced that at least some of the photographs were genuine. The physical resemblance was too strong to ignore, and certain details in the images corresponded with information about Amy that had not been made public. Most significantly, one photograph appeared to show a distinctive scar on the woman's leg that matched a scar Amy had from a childhood accident. In 2005, 7 years after Amy's disappearance, the case took another dramatic turn when a witness came forward with new information about the night Amy vanished. A former crew member from the Rhapsody of the Seas contacted the FBI and claimed to have witnessed Amy being assaulted by several crew members on the night she disappeared. According to this witness, who had remained silent for years out of fear for his own safety, Amy had been drugged and sexually assaulted by multiple crew members in a cabin on the lower deck of the ship. The witness claimed that when Amy tried to resist and threatened to report the assault, the situation escalated and she was accidentally killed during a struggle. The witness alleged that Amy's body had been disposed of overboard to cover up the crime, and that several crew members had conspired to hide evidence of what had happened. He provided specific names and details about the alleged perpetrators, many of whom had continued working on cruise ships throughout the Caribbean. This account was both devastating and confusing for the Bradley family. If true, it meant that Amy had died on the night she disappeared, and that the photographs they had received over the years were either fabrications or showed other victims of human trafficking. The FBI investigated the witness's claims extensively, but could not find corroborating evidence to support his account. Several of the crew members named by the witness were tracked down and interviewed, but all denied any involvement in Amy's disappearance. Some had solid alibis for the night in question, while others had returned to their home countries and were difficult to locate or interview. The conflicting evidence and theories in Amy's case created an agonizing situation for her family. They didn't know whether to hope that she was still alive somewhere in the world, suffering but potentially rescuable, or to accept that she had died on the night she disappeared and begin the process of grieving and moving forward. Ron and Eva Bradley chose to continue believing that Amy was alive. They increased their efforts to search for her, traveling to countries throughout Central and South America, working with anti-trafficking organizations, and following up on every credible lead they received. Their search took them to some of the most dangerous places in the Western Hemisphere. They visited brothels in Guatemala, searched beaches in Colombia, and worked with undercover investigators in various Caribbean nations. Each journey was emotionally and physically exhausting, but they felt they had no choice but to continue looking for their daughter. The Bradley family also became advocates for other families of missing persons, particularly those who had disappeared in international waters or foreign countries. They learned that Amy's case was far from unique. Dozens of people disappeared from cruise ships every year, and many cases received little attention or investigation. Working with congressional representatives and maritime safety organizations, the Bradleys pushed for legislation requiring better security measures on cruise ships, more thorough background checks for crew members, and improved coordination between cruise lines and law enforcement agencies when passengers went missing. Their advocacy work led to the passage of the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act in 2010, which required cruise lines to install better lighting and security cameras, provide sexual assault kits on all ships, and report crimes to the FBI immediately. While this legislation came too late to help Amy, it potentially protected future cruise passengers from similar fates. As the years passed, the number of alleged sightings and photographs decreased, but they never stopped entirely. The Bradley family continued to receive occasional reports of women who might be Amy, and they investigated each one with the same desperate hope and determination they had shown from the beginning. In 2010, 12 years after Amy's disappearance, they received what seemed like their most credible lead yet. A former U.S. Special Forces soldier contacted them with a disturbing account of encountering a woman in a Barbadian brothel who claimed to be Amy Bradley. According to the soldier, who was working as a private security contractor at the time, he had been taken to an upscale brothel in Bridgetown by local contacts. There he encountered a young woman who approached him and whispered that her name was Amy Bradley, and that she had been kidnapped from a cruise ship years earlier. The woman allegedly begged the soldier to help her escape, providing details about her background that seemed to match Amy's story. However, before the soldier could respond or get more information, the woman was quickly removed from the room by several men who appeared to be her handlers. The soldier said he tried to locate the woman again, but was told by brothel management that she had been transferred to another location. He reported the incident to local police but was told there was nothing they could do without more specific information. This account was investigated extensively by both the FBI and private investigators hired by the Bradley family, but like so many other leads in Amy's case, it ultimately led nowhere. The brothel in question denied any knowledge of the incident, and no trace of Amy or anyone matching her description could be found. As Amy's case entered its second decade, the investigation had consumed the Bradley family's lives in ways they never could have imagined. Ron Bradley had taken early retirement from his job to focus full-time on searching for Amy, while Eva had transformed their home into a virtual missing persons headquarters, maintaining extensive files and coordinating with investigators around the world. The financial cost of their search had been enormous. The Bradley family had spent their retirement savings, taken out second mortgages, and relied on donations from supporters to fund their international investigations. They had hired private investigators in more than a dozen countries, paid for translation services, and traveled thousands of miles following leads that ultimately went nowhere. But the emotional cost had been even greater. The constant cycle of hope and disappointment, the sleepless nights wondering about Amy's fate, and the strain of maintaining their search while trying to live normal lives had taken a tremendous toll on the entire family. Brad Bradley, Amy's younger brother, struggled with survivor's guilt and the feeling that he should have stayed with his sister that final night on the cruise ship. Ron and Eva's marriage had been tested by the relentless stress of their search, but their shared commitment to finding Amy had ultimately strengthened their bond. They had become a team in the truest sense, with each handling different aspects of the investigation, while supporting each other through the darkest moments of their journey. The Amy Bradley case had also attracted attention from amateur investigators and online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. Internet forums and social media groups discussed every aspect of Amy's disappearance, analyzing photographs, debating theories, and sometimes generating new leads for the family to investigate. While the Bradley family appreciated the support and attention from these online communities, they also had to deal with conspiracy theories, false information, and well-meaning but misguided amateur investigators who sometimes complicated their search efforts. They learned to carefully evaluate information from online sources, while remaining grateful for the genuine help and support they received. In 2012, the FBI made a significant announcement regarding Amy's case. After 14 years of investigation, they officially changed Amy's status from missing person to kidnapped, indicating that they now believed she had been the victim of a crime rather than an accident or voluntary disappearance. This change in status was both validating and heartbreaking for the Bradley family. It confirmed their long-held belief that Amy had been abducted, but it also acknowledged the likelihood that she had been victimized in ways too horrible to contemplate. The FBI increased the reward for information leading to Amy's recovery to $25,000, hoping that the increased incentive might encourage someone with knowledge of her fate to come forward. The reclassification of Amy's case as a kidnapping brought renewed media attention and generated new tips from around the world. Television shows, documentaries, and news programs featured Amy's story, reaching millions of people who might have encountered her or her captors. Each media appearance was emotionally difficult for the Bradley family, but they continued to participate in hopes that increased visibility might lead to a breakthrough. One of the most significant developments during this period was the growing recognition of human trafficking as a serious international crime. Law enforcement agencies around the world began to better understand the scope and methods of modern slavery operations, and Amy's case was increasingly viewed as a potential trafficking situation rather than an isolated criminal act. The Bradley family worked closely with anti-trafficking organizations, learning about the tactics used by traffickers and the experiences of survivors who had been rescued from similar situations. These interactions were both educational and heartbreaking, as they learned about the reality of life for trafficking victims and the challenges involved in rescue and recovery operations. Through their work with these organizations, the Bradleys learned that many trafficking victims were moved frequently between locations and countries, making them extremely difficult to track and rescue. Victims were often held through a combination of physical force, psychological manipulation, and drug dependency, creating complex situations that required careful planning to resolve safely. This knowledge gave the Bradley family both hope and despair. If Amy had been trafficked, she might still be alive after all these years, but her rescue would require incredible luck, extensive resources, and perfect timing. The family continued to travel to potential locations and work with local law enforcement, but they began to understand the enormous challenges they faced. In 2015, 17 years after Amy's disappearance, the Bradley family received what they believed might be their most credible lead yet. A woman who had been rescued from a trafficking situation in Colombia contacted them through an anti-trafficking organization, claiming that she had been held with a woman who said she was Amy Bradley. According to this woman, who had been trafficked herself for several years before being rescued, she had encountered Amy in a compound outside Cartagena, Colombia, in 2013. The woman provided detailed descriptions of Amy's appearance and behavior that seemed to match what the Bradley family would expect after 15 years of captivity. The rescued woman claimed that Amy had told her about being kidnapped from a cruise ship and had provided details about her family and background that matched information not publicly available. Most significantly, Amy had allegedly shown the woman a distinctive scar on her leg and explained how she had gotten it as a child, information that perfectly matched Amy's medical records. The Bradley family immediately flew to Colombia to meet with this woman and investigate her claims. The meeting was emotionally overwhelming, as they listened to detailed descriptions of conditions in the trafficking compound and Amy's alleged situation there. The woman's account was consistent and believable, and she had no apparent motive to fabricate her story. However, when investigators attempted to locate the compound described by the rescued woman, they found that it had been abandoned months earlier. Local authorities said that trafficking operations frequently moved locations to avoid detection, and it was possible that Amy and other victims had been transferred elsewhere. The Colombia lead generated intensive search efforts involving Colombian authorities, FBI agents, and private investigators hired by the Bradley family. They searched dozens of locations, interviewed hundreds of people, and followed every possible connection to the trafficking organization allegedly holding Amy. Despite months of investigation and significant financial expenditure, the Colombia search yielded no concrete evidence of Amy's presence or location. The rescued woman's account remained uncorroborated, and investigators were unable to find any trace of the trafficking operation she had described. As Amy's case approached its 20th anniversary, the Bradley family faced the reality that their search might never end. They had investigated hundreds of leads, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and traveled to dozens of countries, but Amy remained missing. The physical and emotional toll of their 2-decade search was enormous, but their commitment to finding their daughter never wavered. Ron Bradley, now in his 70s, continued to maintain detailed files on every aspect of Amy's case. Eva Bradley, despite her own health challenges, continued to coordinate with law enforcement agencies and follow up on new leads. Brad Bradley, now a father himself, struggled with how to explain to his own children why their aunt had been missing for most of their lives. The family had learned to live with uncertainty in ways that most people could never imagine. They celebrated holidays and birthdays while wondering where Amy might be. They made plans for the future while always being ready to drop everything if a credible lead emerged. They tried to maintain hope while preparing themselves for the possibility that they might never learn the truth about what happened to Amy. Their search had evolved from desperate urgency to determined persistence. They no longer expected quick resolutions or dramatic breakthroughs, but they refused to give up hope that Amy might still be found, or that someone with knowledge of her fate might finally come forward. After more than 2 decades of investigation, the Amy Lynn Bradley case had generated numerous theories about what happened on that March morning in 1998. Each theory was supported by certain pieces of evidence while contradicted by others, creating a complex puzzle that has never been definitively solved. The first and most straightforward theory was that Amy had accidentally fallen overboard from the Rhapsody of the Seas during the early morning hours of March 24th. This theory was initially favored by cruise ship security and some investigators, because it provided a simple explanation for her disappearance without requiring criminal activity or conspiracy. Supporters of the accidental death theory pointed to Amy's reported level of intoxication on the night she disappeared, the ship's motion in rough seas, and the relatively low safety railings around passenger decks. They argued that Amy might have gone out on deck for fresh air, lost her balance, and fallen into the Atlantic Ocean without anyone witnessing the accident. However, this theory was contradicted by several important factors. Amy was an experienced athlete who was comfortable around water and unlikely to accidentally fall overboard. The ship's safety railings, while not extremely high, were designed to prevent accidental falls. Most importantly, no one reported hearing a splash or cry for help, despite numerous passengers and crew members being awake and active during the early morning hours. The second major theory was that Amy had committed suicide by jumping overboard. This possibility was considered by investigators because it would explain her sudden disappearance without requiring the involvement of other people. However, Amy's family and friends unanimously rejected this theory based on her personality, mental state, and behavior during the cruise. Amy had shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation before or during the cruise. She had been making plans for her future, including her teaching career and various personal goals. Her behavior during the cruise had been normal and happy, with no indication of emotional distress or psychological problems. Additionally, Amy had never expressed any thoughts about suicide or given any indication that she was considering harming herself. The third and most disturbing theory was that Amy had been the victim of foul play, either aboard the cruise ship or after being taken ashore. This theory gained credibility as the investigation progressed and evidence emerged suggesting that Amy's disappearance was not accidental. Within this broad theory of foul play, several specific scenarios were considered. The first was that Amy had been assaulted and killed aboard the ship, with her body disposed of overboard to cover up the crime. This scenario was supported by witness reports of crew members acting suspiciously and asking about Amy's whereabouts before her disappearance was officially reported. The witness account from the former crew member, who claimed to have seen Amy being assaulted by multiple crew members, provided specific details supporting this theory. However, investigators were unable to corroborate his account or find physical evidence to support his claims about what happened in the alleged crew cabin. A variation of this theory suggested that Amy had been accidentally killed during a sexual assault rather than murdered intentionally. This scenario might explain why her body was never found. If the perpetrators panicked after accidentally causing her death, they might have disposed of her body overboard to avoid prosecution for murder. The fourth major theory, which gained increasing support as the investigation progressed, was that Amy had been kidnapped and trafficked into modern slavery. This theory was supported by the numerous alleged sightings of Amy in various Caribbean locations, the suspicious photographs received by her family, and the accounts of witnesses who claimed to have encountered her in brothels and trafficking situations. The human trafficking theory explained many aspects of Amy's case that other theories could not address. It accounted for the witness sightings throughout the Caribbean, the photographs showing a woman who appeared to be Amy in distressing circumstances, and the organized nature of what seemed to be a coordinated effort to hide evidence of her disappearance. Experts in human trafficking explained that cruise ships were attractive targets for traffickers because they provided access to large numbers of potential victims from different countries, complex jurisdictional issues that made investigation difficult, and opportunities to move victims between countries without detection. The Caribbean region was known to be a hub for trafficking operations, with networks that moved victims between islands and countries throughout Central and South America. Young American women were particularly valuable to traffickers because they could be sold to clients who were willing to pay premium prices for Western victims. However, the trafficking theory also had significant weaknesses. Despite hundreds of alleged sightings and years of investigation, no concrete evidence had ever been found to prove that Amy was being held against her will. The photographs received by her family while disturbing had never been definitively authenticated or traced to their source. Additionally, trafficking experts noted that it would be extremely unusual for traffickers to risk taking a victim from a cruise ship, where the disappearance would immediately trigger an international investigation. Most trafficking victims were taken from less secure environments, where their disappearance might not be noticed or investigated as thoroughly. A fifth theory suggested that Amy's disappearance was the result of a more complex criminal conspiracy, possibly involving organized crime groups operating in the Caribbean. This theory proposed that Amy had inadvertently become involved with dangerous individuals, either through her interactions with crew members or through activities during shore excursions. Supporters of this theory pointed to reports that some crew members had connections to criminal organizations in their home countries, and that cruise ships were sometimes used as meeting points for international criminal activities. They suggested that Amy might have witnessed something she shouldn't have seen, or become involved in a situation that put her in danger. However, this theory lacked specific evidence and relied heavily on speculation about Amy's activities and interactions during the cruise. There was no indication that Amy had been involved in any criminal activities or had encountered dangerous individuals before her disappearance. The sixth and most optimistic theory was that Amy had voluntarily disappeared, either to escape some unknown problem in her life, or to start over somewhere else. Proponents of this theory suggested that Amy might have planned her disappearance in advance and used the cruise as an opportunity to fake her own death and assume a new identity. However, this theory was contradicted by everything known about Amy's personality, relationships, and circumstances. She had close relationships with her family, no serious personal problems, and no apparent motive for wanting to disappear. Additionally, voluntary disappearance would not explain the alleged sightings of Amy in trafficking situations or the disturbing photographs received by her family. The complexity and contradictions in these various theories reflected the fundamental challenge of Amy's case. There was enough evidence to support multiple scenarios, but not enough definitive proof to confirm any single explanation for what happened to her. As investigators and amateur sleuths continued to analyze Amy's case, new theories occasionally emerged based on fresh evidence or different interpretations of existing information. Some focused on specific individuals who had been aboard the cruise ship, while others examined broader patterns of criminal activity in the Caribbean region. Despite decades of investigation and speculation, the truth about what happened to Amy Lynn Bradley remained elusive. Each theory offered a possible explanation for her disappearance, but none could account for all the evidence or answer all the questions raised by her case. For Amy's family, the various theories provided both hope and anguish. Some scenarios suggested that Amy might still be alive, offering the possibility of eventual rescue and reunion. Others implied that she had died years ago, suggesting that their long search might be futile. The uncertainty was perhaps the most difficult aspect of their ordeal, not knowing whether to hope for Amy's return or to grieve for her loss. As Amy's case entered its third decade, the impact of her disappearance extended far beyond her immediate family. The Amy Lynn Bradley case had become one of the most well-known missing person cases in modern history, inspiring changes in maritime security, advances in missing person investigation techniques, and increased awareness of human trafficking issues. The Bradley family's tireless advocacy had led to significant improvements in cruise ship security and passenger safety protocols. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act of 2010, which was directly influenced by Amy's case, required cruise lines to implement better lighting, install more security cameras, provide sexual assault kits, and report crimes to the FBI immediately. While these changes came too late to help Amy, they potentially protected thousands of future cruise passengers. Ron and Eva Bradley had become reluctant experts on international missing person cases, human trafficking, and maritime law. They frequently spoke at conferences and seminars, sharing their experiences with other families of missing persons, and helping them navigate the complex world of international investigations. Their expertise, gained through years of heartbreak and frustration, had become a valuable resource for others facing similar tragedies. The case had also influenced how law enforcement agencies approached missing person investigations, particularly those involving international waters or foreign countries. The FBI's handling of Amy's case had demonstrated both the challenges and importance of international cooperation in such investigations, leading to improved protocols for working with foreign law enforcement agencies. Amy's story had been featured in numerous television documentaries, news programs, and true crime series, reaching millions of people around the world. Each media appearance brought new tips and potential leads, though most ultimately proved to be false or unsubstantiated. The family continued to participate in media interviews, always hoping that increased visibility might lead to the breakthrough they desperately sought. The rise of social media and internet-based investigation communities had brought new dimensions to Amy's case. Facebook groups, Reddit threads, and dedicated websites maintained by amateur investigators kept her story alive and occasionally generated new theories or leads. While the Bradley family appreciated this continued attention, they also had to carefully evaluate information from online sources and deal with conspiracy theories and misinformation. Private investigators and security consultants had studied Amy's case extensively, using it as an example of the challenges involved in maritime missing person investigations. Her disappearance had highlighted gaps in cruise ship security, jurisdictional issues in international waters, and the difficulties of conducting investigations across multiple countries, with different legal systems. The case had also contributed to increased awareness of human trafficking as a serious international crime. Anti-trafficking organizations frequently referenced Amy's case when discussing the vulnerability of tourists and the sophisticated networks used by modern traffickers. While it remained unclear whether Amy had actually been trafficked, her case had helped educate the public about the reality of modern slavery. For the Bradley family, the years had brought a gradual acceptance that they might never learn the complete truth about what happened to Amy. However, they had never stopped hoping that she might still be alive somewhere, or that someone with knowledge of her fate might finally come forward with information. Ron Bradley, now in his late 70s, continued to maintain his extensive files on Amy's case, though age and health issues had forced him to reduce his travel and investigation activities. Eva Bradley remained committed to following up on credible leads, though she too had been affected by the physical and emotional toll of their decades-long search. Brad Bradley, Amy's younger brother, had struggled throughout his adult life with survivor's guilt and the feeling that he should have done more to protect his sister on that final night. He had sought counseling to deal with these feelings, and had gradually learned to channel his grief into supporting his parents' continued search efforts, while building his own family and career. The extended Bradley family and friends had provided crucial support throughout the years, offering both emotional comfort and practical assistance with the investigation. Many had contributed financially to search efforts, participated in awareness campaigns, and helped maintain hope during the darkest periods of the family's ordeal. As new technologies emerged, the Bradley family had embraced various tools that might help in their search for Amy. DNA databases, facial recognition software, and improved communication networks had all been utilized in attempts to locate her or identify the people in the anonymous photographs they had received. The family had also worked with psychics, remote viewers, and other alternative investigators, though they maintained a healthy skepticism about such methods. While they were willing to explore any potential avenue that might lead to Amy, they continued to focus primarily on conventional investigation techniques and law enforcement cooperation. International cooperation remained a crucial aspect of the ongoing investigation. The FBI continued to work with law enforcement agencies throughout the Caribbean and Latin America, following up on leads and maintaining awareness of Amy's case among international investigators. Interpol had distributed Amy's information globally, and her case remained active in multiple countries. The reward for information leading to Amy's recovery had been increased several times over the years, and remained substantial enough to potentially motivate someone with knowledge of her fate to come forward. The Bradley family had made it clear that they were interested in any information about Amy, regardless of the circumstances, and were committed to protecting the safety of anyone who might be willing to help. One of the most challenging aspects of the continuing investigation was evaluating new leads and alleged sightings. The family received regular reports from people claiming to have seen Amy or encountered her in various locations. Each report required careful evaluation to determine its credibility and potential value, a process that was both time-consuming and emotionally draining. The Bradley family had learned to balance hope with realism, maintaining their belief that Amy might still be alive while acknowledging the harsh realities of their situation. They had developed coping mechanisms for dealing with disappointment and had found ways to honor Amy's memory while continuing their search. Their home in Petersburg, Virginia, remained a testament to their unwavering commitment to finding Amy. Maps of the Caribbean and Central America covered the walls, filing cabinets contained thousands of documents related to the investigation, and photographs of Amy at various ages served as constant reminders of what they were searching for. Friends and neighbors had watched the Bradley family's transformation from a typical suburban family into dedicated missing person investigators, with a mixture of admiration and concern. The community had rallied around them over the years, providing support, donations, and volunteer assistance with various aspects of their search efforts. As they looked toward the future, the Bradley family remained committed to their search for Amy, while acknowledging that the nature of their efforts might need to evolve. Age and health considerations were beginning to limit their ability to travel extensively, but they continued to coordinate with investigators and follow up on credible leads. They had also begun to focus more attention on helping other families of missing persons, sharing their expertise and resources with others facing similar situations. This work provided them with a sense of purpose beyond their personal search, and allowed them to honor Amy's memory by helping others. The Amy Lynn Bradley case remained officially open and active, with the FBI continuing to investigate new leads and maintain international cooperation efforts. While the intensity of the investigation had necessarily decreased over the years, law enforcement agencies remained committed to solving the case if new evidence emerged. For the thousands of people who had followed Amy's story over the years, her case represented both the best and worst of human nature, the devastating evil that could steal a young woman from her loving family, and the unwavering love and determination that could sustain a search for more than 2 decades. As we reach the end of Amy's story tonight, we're reminded that some mysteries remain unsolved, some questions unanswered, and some families continue to search long after others might have given up hope. The Amy Lynn Bradley case represents one of the most perplexing disappearances of our time, a puzzle with pieces that never quite fit together to form a complete picture. 26 years have passed since that March morning when a vibrant young woman vanished from a cruise ship in the Caribbean Sea. In that time, her family has never stopped looking for her, never stopped believing that she might still be out there somewhere, never stopped hoping that someone someday might provide the answer they desperately seek. Amy's story has touched millions of people around the world, inspiring changes in maritime safety, improvements in missing person investigation techniques, and increased awareness of human trafficking. Her legacy extends far beyond the tragedy of her disappearance to encompass the positive changes that have emerged from her family's tireless advocacy and determination. The Bradley family's search continues today, though necessarily changed by the passage of time and the realities of advancing age. They remain hopeful that new technologies, fresh perspectives, or someone's decision to finally tell the truth might yet provide the breakthrough they have sought for so long. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll remember Amy Lynn Bradley, not just as a victim of an unsolved mystery, but as a beloved daughter, sister, and friend whose disappearance sparked decades of love, determination, and hope. Her story reminds us that behind every missing person case is a family who refuses to give up, a community that continues to care, and investigators who never stop searching for the truth. In the gentle sound of rain against your window, in the distant rumble of thunder, in the peaceful darkness of night, Amy's story continues. Somewhere out there, the truth about what happened on March 24th, 1998, still waits to be discovered. Until that day comes, Amy Lynn Bradley remains not just missing, but remembered, loved, and never forgotten. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.